DA, Chapter 81. Guns on the Dance Floor 2. And they didn't take it well, I'm guessing, Medusa finished as she glanced back into the darkness where the Fates ounce were. Not at all, Phoebe sighed as they finally arrived at the door leading out of her office. It soundlessly opened again as three stepped out and turned towards the throne room. As they walked near the constant stream of gods and titans moving on into the room, many noticed Phoebe and gave bows or curtsies to her, which she acknowledged with nods of her own. Once they made it through the grand arch leading into throne floor, Medusa and Arachne split off towards the numerous seats spread about the hall facing the thrones while Phoebe moved on, growing by the step, to her throne. Medusa quickly found her seat next to Lamia and Lupa, the wolf goddess making a showing of being in her human form, donning a similarly small black dress to Medusa and Lamia. Once comfortably in her seat, Medusa turned her gaze to the thrones and marveled at the imposing sight of all the council finally gathered before their subjects for the first time since forming. Each was dressed formally, in either dresses colored to their domains, or suites. Medusa's eyes immediately went to Percy and she couldn't suppress a shiver at the sight. He, like the rest of the council, were currently in what she dubbed ruling mode, the very same that had made her feel like a bug when she'd supported Andromeda while facing Rhea and Hestia. Luckily, it seemed that even if the last 2 weeks have shown some odd tensions between some members, right here and now they were a unified front, all personal issues held back. Each of their eyes glowed in the shades of their power, that same power that pulsed off them so thickly that Medusa could actually see the air distortion around every one of them. If there were any gods in the city that held a doubt for the council, it was quickly washed away. Soon the chamber settled as each god found their place and turned to attention, all eyes slowly drifting to Percy as he cleared his throat. "Thank you for joining us," he said in deep and smooth voice. "It seems that tonight, our long wait finally pays off." Some chuckles ran out amongst the audience, several even giving malicious grins knowing exactly what it is they've been waiting for. And judging by Percy's fanged smirk, he was very eager himself. "Now, I'm not one for grand speeches and I've personally dealt with too many idiots going on and on without ever actually getting anything done. So, without further ado, I believe the Olympians are about to call their own meeting. Let's watch, shall we?" With a wave of his hand, the light in the chamber dimmed significantly while Hestia snapped her fingers, causing the hearth's flame to grow and spread into a massive orb in the center of the throne room. Within a few seconds a projection appeared within the fire, displaying the very throne of Olympus. Athena Pav, the goddess of wisdom, sat tensely in her throne, the very air within the room feeling like a pressure cooker as tempers and paranoia alike ran at an all-time high. The throne room had never been so full before as gods of both Greek and Roman pantheons sat side by side, each god having absorbed their other aspects in enough to be a hair trigger from assuming their divine forms, causing the space around them to literally steam. The spouses of even the council members were given small adjoining thrones to sit in, and more smaller thrones and tables had been set up to offer spacing for every representative present. Demigods, veterans of the last wars, had been called forth, and for all those that couldn't attend were watching from the camps or their bases. Iris, after some negotiation, had agreed to form massive IMs to Camp Halfblood's amphitheater and New Rome's Senate House, where almost all demigods and allied nature spirits were collected to watch. Even contingents from small retired legionnaires and the Queen of the Amazons, Hyla, was present, and all looking nervous underneath her perceptive, gray eyes. This had never been done before, but Athena knew that her father was getting desperate and all the Olympians that remained were worried. More and more gods, minor though they may be, were simply vanishing into thin air. Hestia's kidnapping and now possibly Ares being Mia as well, the council needed to come together. She glanced across from her seat, her eyes narrowing as they set on her half-brother as the bastard picked his overly white teeth with a bronze toothpick and looking as nonchalant as he could. She knew it was a facade though. His were constantly shifting around, his back was tensed and straight, his left foot was tapping. To make matters worse for him, his wife was still shooting him evil glares from time to time. Her daughter, how she lamented ever agreeing with Zeus on having Annabeth marry Apollo. Honestly, she was somewhat still disappointed with her too, especially after how Annabeth all but let Percy get away. Maybe she could have been enough to persuade Percy to becoming a god, but no. The girl had to fall for Apollo of all people, and even after Athena chewed her out and nearly killing Apollo, the pair continued their little affair. Then again, it could have been her chance to snag herself a proper husband. One that she knew would never cheat and, if honest with herself, rather attractive. Then of course he had to go and give godhood up again, as if being mortal was better. Regardless, Percy was gone now, and no matter who or what tried to track him, they always came up empty. However, it seemed that Percy had set a pattern, and now several powerful heroes were making the task of hiding the disappearances a rigged game. The camps were biting at their heels, wanting to know what was going on and delivering reports of their own problems. Chiron's report on how the influx of demigods had fallen slowly over the last 5 years to barely any arrivals within the last year was increasingly alarming. Sure, right now the numbers in both camps were at all-time highs, both numbering in the several hundred each with the influx of children after Percy's first request. Now though things were silent and every god could feel a shift in the air. There had been a surge of power in the north and many of the satyr teams sent to investigate didn't come back. Lupa and her entire pack was gone, leaving the wolf house abandoned. Even Atlas was gone along with the golden apple tree and his daughters. Now the gods were visibly worried during their meetings and far more prone to violent action even without Ares to instigate them. Athena did a quick sweep as some more minor gods filled in along with the final arrivals of senior demigods and the veterans. Artemis was to her side, the goddess, hands nervously fiddling with an arrow, her two accompanying hunters sitting tensely at her feet while shooting distrustful looks at any male that happened to be too close. Demeter was fidgeting and unlike usual, wasn't going on and on about grains or whatnot. Aphrodite, much to everyone's shock, didn't look nearly as attractive as usual. Puffy eyes from crying, slight mistakes in her mascara, some of her hair having split ends, and her dress had wrinkles in it. Then there was the obvious lack of her aura and slump in her shoulders, making her look far older and tired, even to the point no one was having a problem looking away from her. Hera to her other side, though managing to keep a decent poker face, still had a slight redness to her eyes and a visible tick of a finger tapping as she stared at the poor excuse for a hearth fire being tirelessly tended by no less than 5 satyrs to even keep the blasted thing from going out, and the entire throne room still felt cold. Her father was looking at it as well, his nostrils flaring as static crackled around him, his bolt not having left his grip in days. Poseidon, if she was being honest with herself, was looking terrifying. His expression was frigid at best, with his jaw set, one hand firmly wrapped around his trident as he shot glances around the room. Amphitrite to his side sat morosely, keeping her face down and featureless, but anyone could see the coldness between her and Poseidon. Ares, much like Hestia's throne, was empty and seemed to gain dust regardless of how often it was cleaned, and several of the gods kept shooting worried glances at it. Hephaestus couldn't seem to put down his hands and spare parts to save his life, his beard smoldering more than usual, but he barely even noticed. Apollo was still picking his teeth while Annabeth sat next to him, her blonde curls pushed out of her face so Apollo could see and likely feel the glares she launched at him, but Athena could see that her grip on her trusty dagger that she'd kept was bone white. Hermes next on the line was disturbingly quiet, his ever-present cell phone stowed away and his little snakes not even hissing as he kept glancing around. Several of his own wind spirits that assisted him for deliveries had disappeared, all along the northern borders, but some randomly in the heart of the U.S. Even more alarmingly, Dionysus was alert and practically oozing nervous energy, not a diet cola in sight. Lastly was her uncle Hades and Persephone. He had been a rather occasional presence to their meetings ever since the debacle dealing with Percy's mortal family, and had only showed during the winter and summer solstice meetings or the few that Hestia had called him to. And everyone knew that he wanted nothing to do with them, but one thing was that he was always punctual. And now, he was not only late but simply not here at all. Demeter looked increasingly worried as time passed, having not spoken to her daughter in well over a month, and now with so many gods not appearing, it was a reason for alarm. Athena had been about to continue on to the veteran demigods present when her father shot a bolt into the sky, effectively silencing the nervous murmurs and beginning the emergency meeting. Order! He boomed, all eyes falling on him. This emergency session has begun. At his words, several IMs formed above the heads of those seated in attendance, projecting the camps and independent groups watching this meeting as well. Now that I have everyone's attention, there are announcements to make, Zeus began as he glanced around, even to the IMs before continuing. As of a month ago Hestia was kidnapped and he couldn't finish as hundreds of voices coming from the demigods erupted in shock and surprise. Only rumors of Hestia's disappearance had reached the camps, but now it was confirmed. Over a minute of uproar, with the present representatives shooting to their feet to get Zeus' attention for explanations continued until Poseidon of all people slammed his trident on the floor. Enough! He roared, his rage evident, stopping everyone dead. Yes, Hestia was taken, but we are not going to lose our heads over this since it does nothing. We have searched and so far found nothing. he said more evenly as some murmuring followed up until a Greek camper and vet, Tracy, stood up. Do we have any clues who took her? She asked, looking around, likely noting how some of the gods shifted uncomfortably. We do, but at the same time we don't, Demeter started as she glanced around nervously. Forgive me, Lady Demeter, but how can that be? Asked one of the new camp counselors, Roger Marcus from Hermes' cabin. We were present when the kidnapping occurred, Hephaestus picked up, his hands stilling for the moment. And we saw who did it. The problem is we knew next to nothing about that person or thing. What do we know? Asked Hyla, her deep brown eyes narrowing as she tried to piece together an image while her 4 Amazon escorts murmured behind her. Apparently it is a demon of some kind calling itself Umbra, Hephaestus answered before waving his hands and causing an image to appear over the small hearth fire. D.A. Chapter 82, Guns on the Dance Floor 3. What do we know? Asked Hyla, her deep brown eyes narrowing as she tried to piece together an image while her 4 Amazon escorts murmured behind her. Apparently it is a demon of some kind calling itself Umbra, Hephaestus answered before waving his hands and causing an image to appear over the small hearth fire. There was silence as many inspected the image of the strange shadow creature. The faceless head with 2 icy blue dots for eyes and a general build of a male being the only features to take from the whole thing. It drove Athena mad that she couldn't find any semblance or mention of this Umbra in any archive she'd searched, and not even the oldest gods accessible to her, and increasingly smaller lists as time went on, knew of this thing. Doesn't look like much, Clarice, another vet, muttered only to get glared at by several of the gods present. Don't let appearances fool you, Artemis growled as she aimed her seething glare at the image. We already know that this thing is at least responsible for the death of one of my oldest hunters. It somehow took Talia, Hestia, and a number of our trackers sent after the trail have disappeared. Among those sent out to search was Lupa and her pack, Athena added, getting several gasps and curses from the Roman camp. Is Lady Lupa? One of the visiting senators trailed off on the question. Dead. Hermes cut in, drawing the attention with a shake of his head. Not that we can confirm, but her trail ended near the Canadian border. It is believed that she may have been taken farther north and beyond our ability to assist. Then we should go after her. One of the new praetors, Crassus Aurelius, demanded while shooting to his feet. And where will you look? Zeus interjected after having carefully watched as the conversations progressed with surprising patience. There is no trail or leads, the gods can't pinpoint her, and for some reason the oracle remains silent. He shot that last jab at Rachel as she sat with the vets, the woman shrinking into her chair. It's not only her, Apollo came to her defense as he glanced at her. I've tried, but my sight barely manages glimpses, and of those few moments, half of them shift into something different right in the middle of it. So we're running blind? Asked one of the elder senators incredulously. Effectively, Hermes muttered as the unease in the room grew. What other gods are missing? Asked Alan Baker, Athena's son and current cabin counselor. That question drew many nervous looks from the council until they all turned their gaze to Zeus, throwing him under the bus with his responsibility as king. After a sweeping glare that promised vengeance, Zeus cleared his throat to speak up. The list of missing gods is actually quite extensive, but some of the more worrying cases, such as Hestia or Hercules, the audience gasped at that, several shocked that a powerhouse such as that legend had possibly been kidnapped. Better they didn't know that his was more of an escape. Atlas, that was a bucket of ice water, won anyone who had seen the fearsome Titan or knew how dangerous he truly was. And Ares. What? Dozens of Roman demigods and his Greek children shouted at the same time, the beginnings of panic spreading through the viewing campers. How could Mars be taken as well? Rhena, reinstated and full-time praetor, asked as she waved for silence from her centurions and senators. We aren't sure, Hermes answered again, being one of the few that spent time with Ares out of meetings. Mostly to pick up women with Apollo as well. We only noticed since he missed 3 meetings in a row, and when we looked, he wasn't in his palace or any of the locations he frequents. Actually, Apollo started, drawing all eyes on him as he squirmed slightly. I looked for one he's pretty popular at, and it was gone. Gone. What was gone? Athena asked as she narrowed her eyes. And what do you mean Ares was popular there? Apollo was looking more uncomfortable by the minute, and knowing he couldn't lie worth a damn, he was stuck. An underground fight club, Apollo answered after sweating for a good 30 seconds, not meeting the eyes of any of the demigods. All fistfights and even deaths. Violence, gambling, and generally the kind of place he loves. Considering I don't want to know what else you do there, what do you mean it's gone? Artemis asked as she thumbed her arrow dangerously. That's just it, he answered. It's gone without a trace. It was literally underground and the entire structure all the way to the one access tunnel on the surface was gone. There isn't even a trace of the building's foundation or any other material besides the natural ground there. It's as if it simply disappeared overnight. Wait a moment, Hermes interjected as he looked at his lap in concentration. I heard about that. Around Las Vegas less than a month ago, over 200 people were reported missing from the same night in the same area. Some politicians, businessmen, police, tourists, and residents. Under the less legal means, entire gangs and prostitutes were also being searched for. So not only was Ares somehow taken, likely at this site, but any and all traces were completely removed as well, Annabeth commented as she shared a glance with Athena. Something very wrong was going on. As far as Athena had seen, Umbra was only a creature of shadows. But if erasing entire structures underground were one of its abilities, what else could it do? What of the missing heroes? Calypso, sitting in a smaller throne next to her husband Leo, asked with a raised hand as the eyes turned to her. Percy, Jason, and Talia have all been missing for some time. Has there been any sign of them? No, my brother, Zeus growled at the empty throne. Last said that Jackson as well as the other three are alive. But that's a good thing, right? Asked Elliot Brown, son of Apollo. I mean, those three were already legends by the time they were teens and now they'd be what, in their 20s or so. If we can find them then maybe they could help us find the missing gods. That's not possible, Poseidon said as he looked sharply at Artemis, Aphrodite, and Apollo. From what I understand at least for Zeus, kids, they left of their own volition and aren't coming back for any reason. What do you mean my lord? Calypso persisted as she looked between the tense gods, all of them knowing exactly what Poseidon was getting at. What I mean is that Talia turned traitor, he replied to the many gasps as Zeus shot up, his bolt crackling in his hand. How dare you? He boomed but Poseidon was having none of it. How dare I? He shot back. Open your eyes you fool. Your daughter chewed into Artemis and then used something she smashed to shadow travel, an ability we all know she doesn't have. And when she left she said, and I quote, Umbra says hello. She was the closest to the first appearance of Umbra as a large black wolf with that girl, Mira, when they appeared, kidnapped Artemis' adopted daughter and killed her lover. They were many shocked looks directed at Artemis from the demigods while the goddess in turn glared venomously at Poseidon but his returning gaze just dared her to try anything. Oh don't give me that look, he continued. Everyone on the damn mountains knows that your hunter was your lover and has been for centuries. Regardless, the fact of the matter is that Talia willingly left and as for Jason, even if he didn't become a traitor as well, he certainly won't want anything to do with us. Poseidon paused as he looked at Aphrodite as the goddess tried to look smaller in her chair. And we all know whose fault is that. Last he was seen, he knocked you out, Apollo, he said while jabbing a finger at the scowling god. And then he disappeared without a trace. Wait, why is it Aphrodite's fault? Leo butted in as he looked around confused. Both Jason and Piper had left the camp before letting anyone know so it didn't surprise Athena that even Leo didn't know the details of that night. At his questions, all the other gods looked at her expectantly as she squirmed in her seat, her eyes already getting wet from whenever her daughter was brought up with that night. Clap, clap, clap. Whatever she was going to say was cut off as the sound of clapping seemed to echo all around making many tense as they searched for the origin of the noise. Nice little meeting going on here, said an unnervingly familiar voice as everyone's eyes were drawn to the shadow next to Hades' empty throne. Slowly a familiar figure of shadows stepped out as Athena's breath hitched and her spear appeared in hand. She was too slow as not even a moment later Artemis notched an arrow, aimed her bow, and let loose. In a split second the arrow as on top of Umbra but he made not motion to dodge before the arrow's simple shot through him and impaled the throne behind him. He glanced at it before reaching for it and giving it a little tug, pulling it out easily. Umbra looked from the arrow to Artemis and back before muttering, cute, before tossing the useless stick aside. Silence reigned as he all but strolled forward, every god and demigod already armed as they eyed him wearily. He looked around himself, his gaze moving slowly over the gathered demigods, even the ones visible through the IMs. Hello, he greeted with a wave, completely at ease. I'm Umbra. No one said a word as the shade stood amongst them. He continued to glance around for a few more minutes before looking towards Zeus. So we wanted to return something of yours, he said as he raised a single hand. We. Athena noted as Umbra snapped his fingers and a portal of shadows opened up in the center of the throne room. Before anyone could say or do anything a body fell out and hit the floor with a meaty thud. At first Athena wasn't sure what it was, but then she gasped at the sight, one of her hands shooting to her mouth as a foul stench assaulted their noses. It was Ares. D.A. Chapter 83. Guns on the Dance Floor IV. At first Athena wasn't sure what it was, but then she gasped at the sight, one of her hands shooting to her mouth as a foul stench assaulted their noses. It was Ares. At human size and looking like he'd nearly been pulled apart. His body was covered in ichor and an unknown black substance, completely nude and battered nearly beyond recognition. From sight alone Athena could tell that one leg was beyond useless and his hips looked broken as well, while part of his right arm was simply gone. Then, with a weak and broken moan, Ares somehow dragged himself to his hands and knees, letting several see that he'd been violently castrated as well. Athena could hear many throwing up from the stench and sight, but the gods remained in shock, unable to look away or do anything. Then Ares raised his head and Hera started to cry right then and there, seeing as how Ares' face had been torn up and his eyes gouged out. However, Ares' head shot towards the sound of his crying mother and did the most shocking thing. He whimpered like a baby, his blood making it look like he was crying gold. "Mommy," he choked as he started to crawl towards her. "It hurts." None could move as they watched the god of war, broken beyond even madness itself, as he crawled like a toddler towards his mother. Hera just kept crying as she looked at her son, but then she got off her throne and shrunk to her human size. "I'm here," she cried as she ran at him with open arms. Click. Athena almost missed the sound, but she glanced only in time to see Umbra with a black gun in his hand, already aimed. She looked back at Ares, the god having sat up on his knees with his arms open, begging to be picked up and carried away to somewhere safe as Hera flung her arms at him. Bang! Ares lurched forward, a hole being blown through his skull with a shower of ichor and flesh. Hera stopped, her arms still open as Ares fell into them. Silence reigned, no one even daring to breathe, as they watched Ares turn to dust, but not the regular golden dust. Instead a wind picked up as he turned to an ashen white dust in his mother's arms. Hera looked down at her hands as the dust filtered through, unable to comprehend what just happened, as were all the other gods. Crack! That sound could have been a bomb as it echoed throughout the throne room as all eyes save Hera's turned to Ares' throne. They watched as cracks spider webbed all along the throne. Then, it just collapsed on itself in a pile of white dust as the wind died down, and then nothing. And it was that nothing that thoroughly terrified Athena. Normally a god's or titan's death left a trail that let the gods feel them moving down to Tartarus. They could feel the consciousness going dormant as the essence sunk into the bowels of the earth, but that didn't happen. There was no essence to speak of anymore, no consciousness moving or slowly fading into the background. There was merely absence. A flame snuffed out without a chance of ever being relit. Ares had faded. Athena's entire body was trembling, in shock and fear or rage and hatred she didn't know. She could feel tears streaming down her cheeks just like all the other Olympians. Then, the unholy silence broken as Hera gave a wail of agony, the heartbreak striking the very core of all who witnessed such brutality as she desperately cupped at the dust that was once her son. Athena could make out the crying of Ares' children from both camps while others couldn't even move, their eyes nailed to the hysterical queen. "First blood goes to us," Umbra said, drawing the gaze of the Olympians as many started to glow with their power to the point the present demigods fell to their knees and gasped for air, not that they were really noticed by the enraged gods. Umbra suddenly drew a spear from thin air as Artemis stood and notched another arrow, but before she could react, he threw his spear. It moved almost too fast for Athena to see, Artemis not faring any better. Sadly her body didn't respond in time as the spear hit home. It pierced straight through her hip and pinned her to her throne as she screamed, ichor flowing down her leg as she dropped her bow. "Milady!" screamed her hunters, their own adrenaline helping to deal with the massive divine pressure around them. "You bastard!" Apollo roared as he lunged at Umbra, sword in hand. Umbra was ready though, ducking under the swing with a golden gladius appearing in hand. In one swift move Apollo was masterfully disarmed and then the gladius was buried up to the hilt through Apollo's right thigh. He could only scream as Umbra kicked him away, the force sending the towering god careening. Athena and several others had been about to move and converge on Umbra, but then he pulled another blade out and they all froze. In one motion Umbra impaled the sword right into the fire of the hearth, extinguishing the flame as cracks spread from it and the whole throne room shook. Athena could also hear screaming coming from the IMs displaying the camps, and she glanced to see that they were all suffering earthquakes and running out to see something. However, her eyes were drawn back to the blade left impaled as Umbra stood next to it, all eyes reading the words etched into the gleaming bronze sword. Anaklusmos. Riptide. The legendary blade of Percy Jackson, greatest hero of the millennia and possibly there ever has been. Cold dread filled their hearts, even the campers having remained looking through the IMs as the earth settled staring at the iconic sword in shock. Take heed Olympians, Umbra said in a booming voice all around them as the shade grew taller, soon towering over even the elder Olympians as the atmosphere grew colder by the second. Your sins have come for you and nothing will stand in our way. Soon each and every one of your heads will roll, Umbra said as he looked at each shell-shocked god. And to all demigods, know this. We are not your enemies, however, should you side with this filth, he said with a dismissive wave at the council. And if you attack us, there will be no mercy. Suddenly all the light started to fail as shadows spread along the roof and Umbra became one with the darkness. Then, like a switch, he was gone with the shadows. We are at war. His voice roared all around them, several minor gods whimpering and other desperately holding onto each other. Athena didn't know what happened. Her knees simply gave out as she fell to them, her spear leaning against her as her arms fell limp, her heart still racing within her chest. She looked around weakly, suddenly feeling exhausted. Artemis was being helped by her hunters and Amazons to remove the spear still driven through her hip. Annabeth gingerly pulled the gladius from Apollo's thigh, and Zeus had moved to holding Hera from behind as the goddess cried her heart out, Aphrodite not too far behind, having taken comfort for once in the arms of her husband. Then Athena did a double take as she looked at the freshly removed spear and then the gladius with Hera's Roman symbol etched near the hilt. It only took her a moment to recognize them as Talia's spear and Jason's gladius, further proof that their heroes, if even alive, would not be there to help again. What have we gotten ourselves into? D.A. Chapter 84, Third Front Eye. Percy sighed as he watched the gods and guests alike mingle around the open courtyard behind the Temple of Primordials. It was lightly decorated with floating solid light lamps above their heads, a refreshment table and snack table running the length of the south end, and even a small band on a stage in front of the sky anchor or white tree of the council as it was known. The soft melodies feel into the conversations going around as gods convened, several having to make appearances for the first time. All manner of minor gods had been turned throughout the years and were now finally in their true home, a few having even brought their own demigod children with them. Percy was sympathetic to the many nervous looks from said teens, most of them looking decidedly uncomfortable with so many beings famously known for throwing the worst temper tantrums for the smallest slights. Luckily there were many nymphs and satyrs milling about as well to make the atmosphere a little lighter. As his gaze passed he noted his fellow council members. He chuckled as he noticed Styx, her ever-teasing smile present, next to both Will and Nico as the pair blushed while sipping their martinis. Farther off Phoebe was speaking to some of her fellow gods born from her generation. Talia was close by, surrounded by some of the present demigods as she answered questions about the past wars and such. Jason was farther down and speaking with Hercules, the strength god's face still beaming after seeing Hera so devastated. It was rather morbid to note how so many of the gods present were brimming with glee at the display, but then again, many of them had been present for the time of gladiators, so taking joy out of an execution wasn't too far-fetched. He personally hadn't really relished in watching it or even doing it. To him it just felt like a job to do and there was no point to try to get anything more out of it. He'd already taken out his own revenge against the late god and all it had been was simply putting the poor bastard out of his misery. He sighed again as he took a sip of his scotch, letting the burning liquid trail down his throat as he spotted the goddess who'd been plaguing his thoughts for many nights now. Andromeda stood off to a side, chatting with Medusa. The distance that had formed between the two had been odd for him. Up until now he really hadn't realized how close she often was with him. Brushing shoulders, lingering touches, simply hugging her and pulling her close because he could. He missed it. He missed her. And most of it was because of his own doubts. Thank chaos that he had two beautiful, strong, and understanding wives that helped him settle his thoughts, and finally come to a decision. The last straw that pushed him to admitting his own feelings in that matter had been Hestia's all too innocent comment while he was sword training, thank goodness he usually trained in Tartarus. Think of it this way, Perce. How do you feel about Andromeda being in another man's arms? His own anger at the thought had surprised him, driven home with how he actually cut down a mountain top in the process. He shook his head to rid himself of the memory and anger with it, barely stopping a growl from escaping his throat as he noticed how many eyes were roving over Andromeda's form from the guests. Luckily he'd had a break without anyone coming up to speak to him, so he immediately set his path towards Andy. He guessed his face must have been intimidating at the moment since none approached but instead moved clearly out of the way. As he moved, Andy's eyes flicked up and met his, her own widening in slight surprise as Medusa glanced back to see him coming as well. Neither moved as he got closer, eyes only on him until he all but stood over them. He absent-mindedly left his finished glass on a passing tray held by a wind spirit as he cleared his throat, feeling rather self-conscious in that moment. Andy, Medusa, he greeted lamely, already berating himself for not having thought of a better approach. Percy, they said together, Andy looking decidedly more nervous, and he knew it was because of him. Percy grunted a bit as he looked around before focusing on Medusa. Mind if I steal Andy away for a while? He asked in a semi-whisper. Medusa looked at him questioningly for a moment before glancing over his shoulder and suddenly breaking into a teasing grin that he'd come to associate with trouble for himself. He really didn't want to know what was it that made her give him that look. Of course, my lord, she replied with an added purr at his title as she gave Andy a quick wink and turning to walk away with a slight sway to her hips. Once she'd seamlessly merged into the crowd, Percy glanced back to Andy, noting her slight blush as she kept glancing down. Cute, he thought as he gingerly took one of her hands in his and gently leading her away from the courtyard and towards one of the little more private paths leading to the extensive gardens around the temple's sides. She didn't resist him as they walked, the hum of the crowd slowly fading into the background until he stopped near a small pond reflecting the moonlight. He turned to look at Andromeda as she still kept her face lowered, her nervousness rolling off her in waves. His lips thinned as he used his free hand to softly tilt her head up, her eyes glistening as she finally met his gaze. He just looked into them, those jewels of lavender that were so calming to him. They stood in silence for some time, neither sure how to begin until Andromeda finally broke the spell. So, they told you. It wasn't a question. Ever since Hestia and Rhea had been confronted by Andy and Medusa, Percy hadn't had a chance to really speak with Andy aside from council meetings. All other times one or the other had been avoiding each other, unsure of what to do with the situation until now. Yes, he said gently as he let his hand fall as her head lowered slightly. I've been talking to Rhea and Hestia about it for some time. And what did they say? She asked as she shuffled slightly. Well, they weren't very happy at first and I didn't even know why. Just that they came to bed being somewhat upset at times, he replied honestly as her gaze fell. But after a week or so they mellowed out and finally told me what happened. Turns out that they might agree to this. Andromeda's head snapped up so fast Percy was worried she'd get whiplash. Really? She asked in a trembling voice. But what about your vows? He sighed as he ran a hand through his hair as he looked at her, wondering how to go about this. They've spoken to Styx and Lady Chaos on the matter, he answered before pausing as he bit his lip. Depending on some wording, as long as all three of us agree to include the person in our relationship, it wouldn't go against our vows. But there is a bit of a catch, he added, seeing how she was starting to get excited. He still didn't know how she would feel about Hestia and Ray's conditions. Andy frowned a bit at the catch part before nodding. Okay, and what are they? And so he told her as best that he could. About his queen's concerns and their past experiences, what they thought about having more women joining their bed, and even how they would be distinguished. As he spoke, Andy's expressions kept changing, ranging from surprise and an especially bright smile at the mention of her possibly marrying him to pensive on the thought of concubines. Once he wrapped up, she scrunched her nose in that cute way that he knew meant she was in deep thought. So, if I agreed I could marry you, she said as she looked at him almost shyly. But I'd also be married to Rhea and Hestia. He nodded as she bit her lower lip slightly before she shrugged. I could definitely deal with that, but, she then paused as she looked at him intently. What do you feel, Percy? I know you'd do this if you knew what it means for me, but I don't want to force you into anything. She then looked down dejectedly. I know you're really noble about these things and I love that about you, but if this makes you unhappy in any. He cut her off with a finger to her lips as his eyes met his again. Then answer me this for a moment. Did you fall in love with me long before you became a goddess? She nodded slowly as his face broke into a smile. And being a love goddess means you can't lie to yourself about your feelings, right? She nodded again, this time looking surer of herself. Then I'll stop denying my own, he replied before he lowered his head to hers. D.A. Chapter 85, Third Front 2. And being a love goddess means you can't lie to yourself about your feelings, right? She nodded again, this time looking surer of herself. Then I'll stop denying my own, he replied before he lowered his head to hers. She gasped in surprise as their lips met for the first time in a gentle embrace. He relished in the soft feel as his arms slowly circled her waist and pulled her closer as she returned it in a moment with her hands rested against his chest. It lasted too short in his opinion though as they heard a throat clearing followed by a snicker as both broke the lip lock and looked towards the noise. There was Hestia and Rhea, both giving fanged grins as they looked between the two, at times eyeing how Percy's arms were still around Andy's waist. He glanced at her and noticed her silvery blush as she cuddled a little closer, partially turning her face away from the two goddesses that would obviously tease her on being caught. So I take it she agreed. Rhea asked as Hestia giggled behind her hand. Yep, he replied, suddenly feeling as an immense weight had been removed from his shoulders, loving the feeling of having Andy in his arms again. Great, Hestia chirped as the two got closer. Then that means we're all engaged. Come here. Rhea shouted in glee as she all but snatched Andy out of Percy's arms and pulled her in for a quick smooch. Andy made a sound somewhere between a squeal and a squawk in surprise, too shocked to actually return it before Rhea broke off. Well, someone needs to get more enthusiastic, she quipped before grinning shamelessly at Percy with quick glances at his lower regions. Enjoyed the view. Yes, he thought while studiously looking to Hestia and denying Rhea her entertainment. At least Hestia was on his side as she cuddled up to him, his arms automatically wrapping around her waist as the pairs eyed each other. So, what now? Hestia asked after some comfortable silence. Percy had been about to suggest heading back to the party for a little longer before heading home until he noticed how Andy was biting her lip nervously. Andy, something on your mind? His question got his wives to focus on the love goddess as well, making said goddess look even more nervous. I think that before we go any further, I need to tell you all something. Yes. Rhea coaxed after Andy remained silent for over a minute, her eyes looking anywhere but them. I might have, sort of, let my domains get the best of me, in regards to Percy, she supplied as they got even more curious. And it has to do with my guardian. Which ones? Hestia asked with an innocent tilt of her head. Procreation, Andy squeaked as she glanced at Percy before blushing furiously, all the while as Rhea narrowed her eyes. Explain, was Ray's order as Andy gulped while shooting Percy a look. It was the same one he'd gotten numerous times whenever Andy had gotten in trouble and was scolded by Nyx, which usually lead to said trouble having some form of connection to him. And he thought his personal troubles had been solved for the evening. Oh well, out of the pan and into the fire. Later in the night. Nikola Pav, are you sure about this? He asked, an unusual amount of sadness in his voice. You said it would have taken possibly another year. What happened? Ideally yes, it would have. By that time the council would have all but crushed most of the Olympians and stabilized most of the mystic world and only left to hunt down the cowards that managed to avoid death on the battlefields, replied a deeper, ancient voice. However, between my assistance in reforming them, training you all, and your own exponential growth in power, it would be best to properly pass on the reins sooner rather than later. How many have awakened and escaped already? He asked as he sighed, his hand running through his dark hair as he looked at his mentor. Koyos, Krios, and Pallas have escaped to the surface already. Luckily the particularly messy titans such as Persis and Menoetius were hunted down and slain by Percy before they could realize I was weakening, Tartarus answered as he slumped into a large throne, looking down at Nico with dulling red eyes from within his ever-shadowing hood. My days were always numbered since the days I created this prison and now that time is here. Nico bit his lip as he digested his mentor's words. Tartarus, as well as the other primordials, had not always been wise or understanding. Once upon a time they were worse than anything the Olympians or Titans could have been combined. A time of endless creation and destruction on this planet until it nearly came to an end for all. When many of the elder primordials finally saw their own folly, it was almost too late. Unspeakable horrors roamed the world, the bones of ancient civilizations predating the modern man lying in ruin and forgotten to most, the skies raining fire and lightning while most of the seas churned with blood and acid. Day was scolding and night was freezing, the very air seeming to pulse with poison mist. And worst of all, was the loss of their children within their own wars. The truth was that none of the known beings, from the hundred-handed ones to the Titans were the first children of the Protogonoi. There had been many before and almost all had met their end under the wrath of the primordials. Who these beings were or why the primordials had been so enraged to begin with, none of the elder gods would say. That horror forced many of the elder Protogonoi into self-imposed damnation. Erebus, suffering from a self-loathing of apocalyptic proportions, used most of his essence to cleanse some of the world before all but taking his own life. That led to centuries of the world being blanketed in night as Nyx wept, even going as far as birthing Aklis, primordial goddess of misery and sadness. Ether, Hemera, and Kronos retreated into the heavens in isolation and shame. Gaia and Uranus went to sleep for a time, unable to cope with the destruction. And the eldest, Tartarus, being unable to eradicate all the creatures on his own at the time, gave up his own true body to create a prison for the monstrosities they had released. Only the strongest of beings could give up their body of birth and then recreate a new one, but Tartarus didn't, as another means of self-punishment. He remained mostly in a phantasmal state, watching over his prison meant to draw the essence of divine beings and monsters alike, keeping them apart where once they used to reform within days unless completely destroyed, and then hopefully keep them imprisoned within. Now with every day he spent with his temporary body created to train the new council and then blessing Nico, his time was running out. Having Nico claim his title as heir had been the final nail in the coffin. So, are you ready to claim your place by your brethren? Tartarus asked, his voice truly carrying the weight of the eons on his shoulders. At Nico's hesitation, Tartarus continued. You know you must. With the last of my strength I will keep the hordes of monsters still within Tartarus contained before you assume your reign, but there will be a window where more could escape, especially the horrors within the bowels of this very castle. As if to prove his point, the entire castle shook with a muffled roar from the ground beneath them, the ancient horrors, as they were known, having stirred upon feeling their shackles weakening. Dust rained down from the dark rafters of the massive hall as Tartarus slumped further into his throne. Nico grit his teeth but accepted that it was time and there was nothing he could do about it. He nodded before straightening himself and standing at attention to give his mentor his last respects. I, Nico D'Angelo, am heir of Tartarus, primordial of the pit. Does anyone dispute my right? Nothing, the dust and faint screams of the damned answered him. Then henceforward I claim my place as primordial of the pit. He shouted as the entirety of the castle began to shake. His entire frame radiated dark red miasma and darkness, his veins glowing with hellfire coursing through them as pain assaulted him, but he kept his eyes level with his mentor. He watched as an orb of churning purple and red phased out of Tartarus and slammed into his own chest, doubling the pain that he felt. It felt like he was burning for hours even if he knew it was only seconds, as he felt an explosion of pressure through his back. He finally dropped to a knee as he panted, the sweat literally steaming off his frame. As he hungrily gulped in the air, he looked up to see his mentor's hood removed for the first time. Skin that had long since grayed and chalk-white hair spilling to his cheeks, dull red eyes set within a sharp face looked at him. Tartarus, the most feared of the primordials, harbinger of damnation, never looked more human and frail even as a small smile adorned his face. With a small nod and silence, a gentle breeze passed on the ancient throne of the eldest son of chaos as he dissolved into white dust that almost looked as pure as billowing snow. His mentor and friend, gone for good. A quiet passing just like he would have wanted, and all the while Nico couldn't stop the single tear that rolled down his cheek. Still, he pushed on as he stood, new power humming within him as the very pit responded to his will, and he was angry. He knew it would pass, but not right now. Right now he missed his mentor, wished that he'd had more time to get to know and learn from Tartarus, to continue training under him and make him proud. To leave Tartarus with some true happiness after such a long time of misery. The others of the council had become the children the elder primordials had lost, and each left with a smile for the brief time their family was whole. Tartarus was family to Nico, and if there was one thing that he could never deal with, it was the loss of family. His fists clenched as he glanced over his shoulders to see his new wings. Black-charred bone, red-torn membranes, and hellfire dripping off the fringes, how fitting. Without pause he turned from the throne as he summoned his blade, damnation, to his hand as he willed the throne floor before him to open. It cracked and groaned as it did so, revealing a seemingly endless pit of darkness and decay, but within Nico could see the glowing eyes. Shades of reds, yellows, and orange locked onto him, growls and the sound of claws scrapping along echoed as the horrors bore witness to their new jailer. They had been lucky. Without his true body, Tartarus had been unable to face them on equal footing and slay them. The other children of chaos had lacked the ability to kill these beings. Their prison had been meant to weaken all but the master of the pit, and none of Tartarus' siblings could wield hellfire, one of the few creations able to destroy even divine essence in mass, until the creation of Percy's voidfire. However, Nico did not suffer these shortcomings. Nico's grip on his sword tightened as the length ignited in hellfire as he glared down at them. He knew Percy had eradicated the horrors locked in the deepest reaches of the House of Night days after ascending himself, and now it was Nico's turn to put to rest the last of the horrors. And if it helped work out his own frustrations, all the better. Without another sound, he took a step and descended into the true hell of this world. D.A. Chapter 86, Third Front 3. He knew Percy had eradicated the horrors locked in the deepest reaches of the House of Night days after ascending himself, and now it was Nico's turn to put to rest the last of the horrors. And if it helped work out his own frustrations, all the better. Without another sound, he took a step and descended into the true hell of this world. Athena Pav. Athena dragged her feet as she walked back into the throne room, her eyes unusually dull as she looked around. The room was a mess, the previously spilled ichor still staining the floor as every torch was put out, and the atmosphere was bitingly cold. Even now Athena could still hear Hera crying even from her palace lower on the mountain, and even now Demeter had joined her sister in terror for her daughter. Mere hours after the demon had appeared, Hades' throne along with Hestia's had cracked and fallen. 2 more Olympians gone as far as they knew, and that had set off another chain of panic and hysterical gods. Demeter worried for Persephone, but none dared venture to the underworld in fear of a trap, yet Demeter had almost gone. Only the swift reaction of Poseidon as he all but tackled his sister and knocked her unconscious before she could flash away had saved Demeter from meeting a possibly similar fate. Olympus was in upheaval as several more palaces and temples connected to numerous gods, many of which had disappeared, had crumbled as well. Then she, along with Apollo, Hermes, Dionysus, Hephaestus, and Artemis, once she was healed enough, had traveled to the camps to get a better look at what had happened, and it wasn't good. In Camp Halfblood, entire cabins for the missing or dead gods had been literally swallowed by the earth. Some of the campers who witnessed it said that it looked like the massive maw of a lion had come forth to destroy said cabins, while the campers of those cabins also vanished. Some fading into shadows, others whisked away in explosions of fire, and even some struck by both white and blue lightning. Dead, kidnapped, or traitors, it was all unknown. Even worse still, Peleus and his charge, the Golden Fleece, had also disappeared without a trace amongst the confusion. New Rome and Camp Jupiter hadn't been much better, with a good half of the military barracks incinerated or leveled with earthquakes. The new Colosseum was beyond repair, and the fields of Mars looked more like a war zone after a bombing. It was nothing short of a miracle that all the present campers had been unharmed, but even then, nearly 150 campers from the camps had disappeared with the attacks. Many of the younger demigods had been struck to the core, and the veterans were trying to run damage control, but it was an uphill battle, not to mention a significant portion of New Rome was screaming for blood to the extent of foaming at the mouths. Seeing one of their patron gods murdered before their eyes had set them off like nothing else since the times of the old Roman Empire. And now it felt like the cold, bitter quiet before the storm, and what was worst of all was that Athena knew nothing to prepare for it. Nothing she'd found even hinted to what or who Umbra was, and now, either by choice or accident, Umbra had let slip that he wasn't acting alone but part of a group. And from what could be found, one had extensive control of the earth if they were able to set of earthquakes that Poseidon couldn't quell. It just felt like everything was falling to shambles around them. She glanced at the damned sword still impaled in the hearth, a thin layer of frost having formed along the cracks and slowly spreading as time went on. The atmosphere was becoming so cold that Athena could even see her own breath and kept having to flex her fingers or else her hands would go numb. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost missed the arrival of her daughter. Mother, Annabeth greeted soberly as she walked up to stand beside the Olympian, both their gray gazes transfixed on the same blade. They stood in silence for some time, both too embroiled in their raging thoughts to really speak much, at least until Annabeth asked a question. How are they? Your siblings? She returned without a glance and knew that Annabeth nodded. Shaken, but they should recover some by tomorrow. I heard that New Rome was already beginning to form up the war council and even called in all retired legionaries from across the country. They have, but it won't do much good right now. Not without a lead at least, Athena supplied. They'll charge north then, it is the only clue any of us have, Annabeth continued as she crossed her arms under her bust. But they could just as easily be heading into a trap. I think Leo and Calypso are going to try and convince them to be patient tomorrow. Athena snorted at that. Leo Valdez, practically the god of ADHD and excitement, telling rabid Romans to wait from going on the war path. I can already taste his success. Never thought I'd see the day you would be sarcastic, Annabeth muttered with a humorless smirk before her face got grim. It isn't just the Romans though. I've never seen Apollo that angry before, and seeing his precious little sister hurt before being humiliated in front of all of Olympus and his children did not help his temper. I had to slap him across the face, otherwise he was going to incinerate our whole temple if he didn't get some control. Ares' children are split up, Athena said as she stepped a little closer to Riptide to get a better look at it. Most of the younger ones are in complete shock in both camps and the older ones were ready to march within the hour. Not to mention with the speculation about Hestia being dead too, a whole contingent of minor gods and several demigods that liked her want revenge too. It's all going to hell, Annabeth sighed as she kicked a shield that had been dropped when all the demigods had armed themselves on Umbra's arrival. Athena grimaced at the sharp clang of the metal but made no move to reprimand her daughter, a part of her also feeling like causing noise if only to distract her thoughts. The Amazons and Hunt are gathering as well, Annabeth commented idly as she watched the previously kicked shield sway along the curve of the guard. Yes, they'll group in New Rome and looks like Artemis is heading for aggressive recruitment from their ranks, Athena agreed as she heard some footsteps ascending the stairs to the throne room. Both goddesses turned to see the angry face of Deimos, son of Ares and god of terror, dressed in full war regalia. The breastplate, plated skirt, and helm all painted to resemble fresh split blood as the god's red eyes flashed with his barely contained rage, the grip on his spear leaving his knuckle bone white. He walked up to them before shooting a baleful glare at Riptide, as if blaming the sword for the fate of his late father, before looking to Athena. Lady Athena, he said curtly, barely managing to show some respect for his higher-ups. I've come to inform you that myself, as well as my brother, will be heading to New Rome to convene with Bellona for the war council. Athena nodded in her acceptance. With her father tending to Hera and Poseidon back in Atlantis mustering his own forces, she was the de facto leader of Olympus and his first acting order had been to seal the mountain and erect a barrier to prevent flashing, thus hopefully cutting off any other gods possibly escaping as traitors. So far she had permitted only a handful of other gods to leave and even then she was keeping a wary eye. Very well, but make sure that there are no actual movements until we can accurately plan an offensive. From what we know, our opponents are in the north but how far and their strengths are still unknown, she replied as she turned to look at the sword again. However, she heard Deimos clearing his throat and turned to him with a raised eyebrow. My lady, he ground out, looking decidedly unpleased with how he addressed her. Could I make a suggestion? Speak, was the curt answer. What of making fodder armies from gathers monsters and the like? If we do not want to risk our forces, what better way than throw together a monsters and have them function as scouts to find our targets? It's risky though, Annabeth cut in as she narrowed her eyes. A monster army could just as easily be turned on as if this demon offers them something better. Not to mention that we don't know if there hasn't been an army gathered already, Athena added. It's just too risky at the moment and besides, counting the Amazons, the Hunt, and both camps along with vets coming back, we have a force of nearly 1,000, the most there has been centuries. Manhattan was defended by a fraction of that and held against thousands of monsters at the call of the Titans, and that's not counting the fact that now Poseidon's armies are available as well. No, we will keep to our current forces for the time being. Deimos didn't look happy at his idea being rejected but kept silent on the matter with a begrudging nod. He then looked to the impaled sword and sneered, why hasn't that sword of the coward been removed? Don't call him a coward, Annabeth retorted as she narrowed her eyes at the god. He faced you and your brother, didn't he? Perhaps, Deimos growled as he set his spear aside and approached the sword. But he isn't here now and this is now just an eyesore. Athena was getting a bad feeling as she looked at the sword as a thin mist wafted off it, but before she could tell Deimos to be careful, he'd already gripped the handle. He grimaced slightly, likely from the cold of the metal, before he started to tug at it. Nothing happened though, and even as Deimos threw his body weight behind his pull, the sword refused to budge. Blasted sword, he grit out as he tossed aside his shield from his other hand. Deimos, just leave it, Annabeth said in frustration, but her words fell on deaf ears. No, he snapped as he moved his free hand to grip the sword along the edge of the hilt. His grasp slipped though and his hand went beyond it, slicing his palm open, the blade edge itself as he cursed out from the sting. Deimos just. Whatever Annabeth or Athena was going to say on the matter was quickly cut off as Deimos suddenly let go of the sword and started screaming. They both looked in alarm as the skin around the cut started to pale and then dull into shades of light blue and streaks of black slowly spreading around his hand. Deimos. They both shouted as they rushed forward, the god throwing himself back as his uninjured hand clutched at the forearm of his left. Make it stop. It's freezing. He shouted as some sort of curse started to rapidly spread through his hand, making its way up his wrist. Stop thrashing, Annabeth shouted as both goddesses tried to hold him down, looking at his freezing limb in increasing alarm. Athena summoned a torch to herself and immediately placed the fire right under Deimos' hand, but it seemed to do nothing as the black-streaked frost continued to climb past the wrist. Deimos' screams had also alerted other gods, and Athena could feel Apollo and Hermes inbound as she held onto Deimos' bicep while Annabeth held his other arm, and the god in question kept screaming and begging for it to stop. In a bright flash, her half-brothers were there, rapidly scanning around with their weapons primed before their eyes settled on Deimos. What happened? Apollo asked as he quickly kneeled and looked to Deimos' arm. Don't touch it. Athena shouted, not knowing it whatever curse had struck Deimos could be spread through contact. He cut his hand on Riptide and started freezing, but the fire won't do anything. By now the frost was almost to Deimos' elbow and the god was in so much pain he'd been reduced to babbling and begging, tears beginning to form in his eyes as he thrashed even harder. Apollo cursed under his breath as he raised his hands over the frozen appendage and began to radiate a mix of raw sunlight and his healing magic, but it barely seemed to slow the spreading frost. D.A. Chapter 87, Third Front IV. Apollo cursed under his breath as he raised his hands over the frozen appendage and began to radiate a mix of raw sunlight and his healing magic, but it barely seemed to slow the spreading frost. His grit his teeth as he increased the input, and soon the frost seemed to slow to a near stop, but at the same time the unharmed skin at the border started to hiss and redden, burning under the sun god's power and making Deimos scream that much more. To Hades with it. Apollo snapped as he pulled out a golden blade and looked Athena in the eyes with his own glowing irises, as if the fury of the sun was behind them. Hold out his arm. What? Hermes and Annabeth called at the same time, but Athena did as was told, knowing that when Apollo had that look in his eyes, he was not one to be disobeyed. She held out Deimos' arm just below the shoulder as the minor god started to pull like a wild and cornered animal, but now Hermes had jumped in and was helping Annabeth to hold down the god. Apollo breathed before raising his blade, the edge glowing golden and steaming in the chilled room, before swiftly bringing it down. With sickening ease Deimos' arm was severed just above the elbow, the god releasing a higher-pitched scream that made Athena's blood curl as she looked at the cauterized stump. All the while Deimos' severed arm fell to the floor before shattering on impact into morbid pieces of clumped flesh and bone. Apollo for his part was trembling as he looked at the stump, his face contorted in fury as Hermes was forced to clock Deimos over the head to knock the poor bastard out. Annabeth and Athena released their holds over Deimos as the god slumped down, the roar of more footsteps approaching while other gods that weren't too busy at the moment flashed in. There was a chorus of noise as the newly arrived gods and some remaining demigods moved around to see what had happened and set up a perimeter, quickly noticing the injured god. Athena glanced to her brother, seeing him still fuming before he muttered under his breath, I couldn't even do anything. Before she could try to say anything on the matter, he waved his hand and disappeared with Deimos in a flash, hopefully taking him to the infirmary. Athena for her part sighed as she stood, feeling even more tired as this terrible day seemed to simply get worse and worse. All eyes were on her, making her grimace before she glanced at Riptide. Nobody touches that sword, she ordered with authority as all nodded. Clear out. They started to shuffle along as Annabeth stood by her side, watching the gods and few demigods move. Athena herself had been preparing to flash to her palace and hopefully get some rest, but then the frantic panting and running drew her attention as another satyr that she couldn't name ran up to her looking panicked. My lady. He started as he nearly fell to his knees. I bring news. What? She asked, already getting a feeling of dread in her chest. The grand oak in the central park, it was destroyed, he answered, the hints of fear-induced madness glinting in his eyes. The Titan Hyperion had escaped. Next morning. Percy Pav. Percy softly sighed as he wished he could be nursing a piping hot cup of coffee in his oversized hand, the dark liquid stirring within its bathtub-sized container, but sadly, he'd lost the appetite within moments of shadow traveling to their throne room. The night had been most eventful. Sure, he was ecstatic that he finally got some closure with Andromeda, and now they were making an attempt at a relationship, first starting only between themselves before involving Rhea and Hestia. However, the revelation of Andy's daughter, which also meant his, was not something any of them had been expecting. Andy had gotten the chewing out of a lifetime for that, and Percy was sure neither Rhea nor Hestia were anywhere near close to collecting everything owed to them. But Andy had owned up to it and was willing to take any punishments either of her queens could concoct. However, that wasn't the pressing issue at the moment. No, rather it was the news delivered just this morning by some of their scouts, and judging by the expressions of the present council members, it wasn't good. Jason was tapping his foot, his gaze on his lap. Talia was focusing on a loose tendril of electricity running between her fingers. Hestia was exchanging worried looks with Rhea across from him while Styx kept glancing nervously at Nico's empty throne. Phoebe also wasn't present, searching for the escapes through her sight, but she'd already been gone for an hour, so he wasn't expecting the best news. As for Andromeda, speak of the devil, he thought as he noticed his fiancé he corrected, approach through the entrance hall, gently encouraging the young woman hiding slightly behind her as they approached. Dressed in a simple white chiton, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders all the way to her lower back. A figure echoing of her mother, tanned skin and eyes the color of freshly cared ice, looking shyly in his direction. He sucked in a breath as he held her gaze, the gaze of his daughter, for the first time. She's perfect, he couldn't stop himself from thinking as she nervously approached, one hand gripping the back of Andromeda's shirt like a child as her icy eyes nervously scanned the primordials present. Each of them watched her in turn, their gazes mostly neutral, but the traces of warmth shone through their eyes. Even Rhea and Hestia, the only two with any reason to dislike his daughter's mere presence, smiled softly at her. After all, she was innocent of all possible transgressions, and so neither of his wives would blame her. However, his musing were cut short as Andy smiled up at him, still in her mortal size, before she slowly stepped aside, leaving their daughter alone before him. She gave something akin to a whimper as she looked at Andy, but her mother made no move to return to her side, instead offering an encouraging smile and nod. Their daughter swallowed thickly before facing him again, the nervous energy rolling off her in waves. "Me, my lord," she said timidly with a small curtsy, her gaze lowered like a subject. He frowned at that, wondering where she got it in her head that she needed to approach him like that. Andy most certainly didn't tell their daughter to be so formal given the perplexed look on her face. He understood that as being essentially an untitled goddess herself and already fully developed, his daughter's mind was also formed and had enough knowledge to get by as an adult until taught more or connected to a domain, but that didn't mean she was necessarily ready to act on it. For all essential purposes, she was a child with the body and knowledge of an adult, and somewhere along that way, she'd thought it prudent to act like a simple subject before their rulers. Well, after years of symbolically and literally flipping off pompous and highly temperamental beings as a pastime, he was having absolutely none of this formality. So with a slight grin, he reached down and placed his hand before her, startling her slightly as she jumped with a squeak. She glanced between him and his hand, as if asking for verbal permission, to which he nodded encouragingly. Getting a shy smile in return, she gingerly sat in his open palm and then he brought her up to his eye level. They stared off for a few seconds before he gave his warmest smile and broke the silence. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "My king," she started, only for him to delicately interrupt. "Hey, none of that now. You're my daughter, you don't need to be so formal with me." That got a slightly surprised look from her, but then it turned into a bright smile as she gazed at him. "Papa," she said, her voice as innocent and pure as she was, as she leaned forward in his hand, her hands reaching for him. Understanding the gesture, he brought her closer until she reached out and hugged what she could of his cheek, her bright smile glowing up at him with a tear or two of happiness. He shared the feeling as he used his free hand, or more specifically, free finger, to gingerly stroke away the tears, all the while mirroring the same smile as your mother. She only seemed to get happier at the comparison, and out of the corner of his eyes he saw Andy beaming from her throne as well, though she winced when moving about. The price to pay for suffering 1,000 spanks from Rhea and Hestia, each. Not his concern at the moment as he focused his attention onto his daughter, pulling his hand back slightly to get a better look at her even though she pouted at the loss of contact, making him chuckle. "Now, can I get my daughter's name?" he asked her, only to have her blush in embarrassment. "I don't have one," she murmured before Percy shot Andy a questioning look. "I thought it would be appropriate for you to name her," the love goddess replied with a shrug, only to wince again with her movement, much to the dark amusement of Rhea and Hestia. "Well then, what to name a beauty like you?" he asked with his usual grin, causing his daughter to blush more while also smiling shyly. However, as she did so, he noticed that her arms were starting to change as black down and feathers started to form along them. He watched in fascination along with the rest of the present council, his daughter also looking at her arms in surprise as they continued to change. Soon her arms had completely changed to rather large, black feathered wings much like his own, with the thumb having turned into an flexile talon. She started at them, perplexed, before she gave one test flap and immediately launched herself with a startled gasp. "Papa!" she cried in alarm as she lost balance within seconds and looked like she was about to fall. Luckily he caught her without issue, even going as far as giving her an amused smile as she sat up in his hand and half-heartedly glared at her wings. So, a little bird much like your mother, he mused as she inspected herself. Yet her feathers had a similar dark aura to mine and her eyes are too icy to be like Andy's birds of paradise. No, she is a predator like me, I can see it, he thought as he noticed the slight fangs she had just barely peeking out through her parted lips. Her wings look like those of a raven. Wait, he paused as he looked at her intently for a moment. She noticed and looked at him while squirming slightly at the intensity in his eyes, until he spoke up. Raven, how does that sound? He asked, wondering if she would approve of the name. She looked at him for a few moments of silence before breaking out in a grin and nodding enthusiastically. So my little Raven it is then, he stated, his newly named daughter beaming at him as she shuffled her arms until they turned back into regular arms in a few seconds. D.A. Chapter 88, 3rd Front B. She looked at him for a few moments of silence before breaking out in a grin and nodding enthusiastically. So my little Raven it is then, he stated, his newly named daughter beaming at him as she shuffled her arms until they turned back into regular arms in a few seconds. I like it, she chirped happily and he was about to introduce her to Rhea and Hestia properly until he sensed a familiar presence approaching. He reacted in reflex and covered Raven as she turned to look at the spot most likely meant for the arrival, but Percy wasn't willing to test if she could stand the sight of a primordial. In a few seconds a bright flash lit the room before fading to reveal a newly arrived Nico. However, this was a newly formed and currently bloody Nico. His distinctly skeletal and hellfire wings shuffling slightly, the now 100-foot god covered from head to toe in grim and black, sludge-like blood along with a few scrapes showcasing his own platinum ichor. His sword was held at his side and he looked remarkably tired, the atmosphere quickly sobering as everyone recalled the feeling they'd gotten late into the night. It had been faint, but even while sleeping, they'd felt Tartarus passing. Percy wasn't really surprised, knowing Tartarus and how he would prefer a quiet passing rather than the rather showy departure of Nyx and the others. Before Percy could ask Nico how he was holding up, he caught the sound of clacking heels and all turned their gazes to the throne entrance as Phoebe ran in, growing by the step until she stood beside the newly arrived primordial of the pit. Without precursor, her eyes glowed in an eerie green light as she spoke. Hail, Nico D'Angelo, primordial god of the pit, judgment, and evil. She declared as a wave of power rolled of Nico. Percy flared his own power to coat Raven and protect her from the aura of malevolence and fear coming off their newest and last member of the Primordial Council. Nico gave a nod to Phoebe and took his seat quietly, leaning his claymore against the side as his white marble throne turned into black bone and brimstone with licks of hellfire coming off the backrest. Phoebe took her seat as well, beginning to session for the morning. Percy glanced at Raven in his hand, deciding to complete introductions later and carefully tucked into a newly formed coat pocket right over his right pec. It seemed like a good spot rather than constantly worry about his movement and accidentally making her fall off or something, and he didn't want to send her out after just meeting her. She squeaked in surprise, but her head quickly popped back out of the pocket as she sent him a questioning look. She didn't press the issue though as she turned to the far more entertaining meeting about to begin, even going as far as snuggling around until she was comfy within his coat of darkness. With that settled, her returned his attention to the floor and noticed that they were waiting on him. Clearing his throat, he turned to Nico first, bringing him up to speed and leaving the matter of Tartarus alone. If Nico wanted to talk about it, he would bring it up, otherwise it was best left unsaid. Nico, I don't know if you were informed since you seemed preoccupied, so just to let you know, several titans have gone off-grid. Namely, Hyperion is free again and Pallas had surfaced recently, but he's out of sight too. And I couldn't find them either, Phoebe added as she bit her lip in worry. I was hoping to find Koyos too, but he's hidden from my sight as well. That did not bode well, not at all. It was one thing for a god or titan to hide their aura as much as possible and minimalize their presence or erecting a barrier to hide themselves, but it was a completely different task to simply disappear from all their combined senses around the planet. The simple matter of the fact was it takes a primordial to run interference with another primordial, and that was something the new council had hoped to avoid at all costs. So, they are moving as well, Jason surmised as he looked around, noting the thin-set lips and narrowed eyes of the council. I thought if we stayed out of his turf he would leave us alone for now, Talia growled as her fingers crackled. Ideally, but as Tartarus said last night, Nico cut in, his voice sounding far more tired than usual. Things are moving faster than we could have anticipated. We know that he didn't approve of us the minute Gio was defeated and that he would try to throw his weight around. Yeah, but was it too much to ask for him to wait until we get rid of our pest problem first? Of course, he'll give us all the time in the world. I mean, it's not like we're all immortal and he hasn't interacted with the mortal or mystic world in millennia since naming Oceanus his favored nephew, Styx said sarcastically. With our luck, anything that has a chance of going wrong will in some way. Someone's being oddly pessimistic, Hestia muttered before focusing on the whole council. Regardless, it would seem that Pontus and Thalassa are becoming active participants in our war, and from the looks of it, they're gathering their own support now. So a third party, huh? Rhea commented as she ran a hand through her deep brown locks. Perfect. Like it wasn't tricky enough with fighting the Olympians while trying to spare as many demigods as we can and trying to reintroduce ourselves into the mortal world. If we are fighting and running socio-political marathons with the mortals at the same time, we're going to be as subtle as the Minotaur in a china shop, Talia commented dryly. So not much chance for all covert operations and slowly ripping apart the Olympians from the inside out. I wouldn't say that, Percy replied with a smirk as his eyes glowed with anticipation. We'll just need to be more creative is all. As far as we know, right now Pontus might be collecting some of the hidden titans and other monsters that managed to escape the pit in the last few months with Tartarus weakening, but he will have to deal with possible interference from the Olympians as well. He then paused as he glanced down at Raven to see her watching all with rapt attention, before he turned to Phoebe. Phoebe, release the barrier hiding our presence. I think it's time that they all know exactly where we are. They're going to be on our doorsteps soon enough. Phoebe sighed as she absently waved her hand and a wave of pressure rolled off the mountain, acting like a beacon to every divine being and monster alike saying the same thing. We are here, come and face us if you dare. Percy couldn't keep the predatory grin off his face as his anticipation grew. He then looked to the ever-silent Lupa, the loyal goddess in her wolf form having laid at his side from the moment he arrived to the room. Lupa, gather the pack, we're heading out within 3 days, he ordered, watching as the goddess, ears perked up before she stood, bowed to him, and leapt away in a burst of shadows to gather his strongest wolves from across the globe. His personal pack, 25 strong and each on par with a minor god, with the strongest 4 and Lupa being near or on Olympian level respectively. So we can finally join in on the action, huh? Jason asked as his normally cool exterior started to thrum with pent-up energy. So, what's first? Phoebe's knowing grin quickly drew their attention as she smirked before answering, well, it looks like the Huntress is getting ready to take her little band out to New Rome via her chariot. Wouldn't it be a shame if something happened along the way? The downright malicious smirks were her only answer. D.A. Chapter 89, Hunter turned hunted eye. Several days later. Jason Pav, the primordial of light, cracked a slight grin as he watched the sight before him. Just over the open courtyard of the Temple of Primordials, Andromeda was currently helping her daughter master her flight skills. Andy was currently at her godly form as Raven flew around her, practicing dives and barrel rolls under the careful observation of her mother. So far she had gotten a good handle on herself, even if the start had been rather rocky, but between Percy and Andy, Raven had progressed quickly and had already shown talent in wielding swords much like her father. Raven had also wormed her way into the heart of the council members within hours, being simply too adorable and bubbly to the point that Rhea nearly hugged the stuffing out of her. Though Jason was a little worried when said goddess got a mischievous glint in her eyes as she looked to Percy. Hestia wasn't far off either, and now that the queens had only started collecting their pounds of flesh from their new fiancé, their attention was turned towards the war and any possible mischief at Percy's expense for the time being. Speaking of pound of flesh, Jason glanced over his shoulder and looked out past the edge of the mountain to see a nearly 100-meter trench still marring the view with trees and boulders crushed around it. That had been the first payment when Rhea walked out with Andy and slugged her across the cheek with enough force to launch her like a cannon. Hell, even days later Andy was still sporting that shiner along her right cheek. He shivered at the thought of what other possible punishments the queens would enact until they allowed Andy to officially marry and consummate said union. He shook his head with a rueful smile as he glanced back and noticed his friend arriving, his own fanged grin being ironically bright for the god of darkness. Percy, he greeted. Jason, Percy returned as he stepped beside him and looked up fondly at his fiancée and daughter. Ready to head out? Jason asked as he noted the sun's descent. A predatory smirk was the answer as Percy opened and clenched his hands. The pack is in position, all they need is some timely deus ex machina, he returned as they both looked to Raven and Andy, who'd returned to mortal size, as the pair descended towards them. Papa! Raven shouted in glee as she tackle-hugged her father in the chest, getting a hearty chuckle from Percy as he returned the embrace. Did you see that? I finally got my flying down. Yes, and good job, hatchling, he teased, making Raven blush and pout. Leave it to Percy to find a way to annoy someone within days of meeting them. Anyways, I'm going to be heading out. Ah, do you have to? Raven asked with big eyes that Percy expertly avoided by focusing on Andy, leaning over Raven to give Andy a quick peck of a kiss. See you all later, he said with a wink before dissolving into shadows before Raven could react, otherwise she would have used her new abilities to hitch a ride with him. Dotting father and clingy daughter, what a pair indeed. Chaos save whatever poor fool or girl tries to get Raven's attention in the future. Girl was practically the princess of the mountain at the moment and had several overly powerful parents, uncles, and aunts all too willing to skin possible suitors alive. Still, Raven was already maturing, and within the next week or so she would probably come into the fully adult mindset necessary for her purpose. She was her mother's guardian after all. Born with the necessary powers and already fully blessed, all that was left was getting her proper attire and weapons before she was set loose. Still, for now he gave a cheery wave to the mother and daughter pair before dissolving into light particles. His world distorted around him for all of 5 seconds before he solidified again in the House of Primordials, near the balcony overlooking the planet below them. He quickly spotted his sister sitting comfortably on the edge, her bow, Genesis, held lazily across her lap. Is it time? She asked without turning to face him, her face set in stone as her eyes narrowed over the continental U.S. Percy's already left to meet up with his pack, Jason supplied as he stepped up beside his sister and looked down at the world. It would be so easy, you know, he idly murmured as he looked at the silent globe while his sister glanced at him. To just attack from here and destroy them all, he continued as a spear of white lightning formed in his hand as his eyes landed on Olympus, the clouds doing little to block his sight. Yeah, but it looks like we're keeping to the moral high grounds rather than going with Armageddon mode, Talia replied with a finishing snort while Jason rolled his eyes. Sure, they were better than the Olympians at this point, but a moral high ground, there was not. Don't worry, you'll get to shoot good old Olympus out of the sky, eventually. Speaking of shooting things out of the sky, Jason continued as he tracked the little sliver dot currently heading out over Missouri. Way ahead of you, Talia returned as she leveled Genesis, a narrow bolt of lightning forming a notched arrow. Remember, shock and awe. We want there to be survivors, mostly, he commented idly. Makes me wonder if it would be more merciful to just take them all out in one shot. Are we sure pushing Artemis into a corner this far will be best? 1. Ancient laws still apply. Artemis is fair game, but intentionally targeting her hunters without a challenge or them attacking first is a big no, unless you pass it off as a freak lightning strike. We declared war though, so hostilities are open, she returned with a quirked eyebrow. It's the principle of the matter, he refuted while doing his best to down his embarrassed blush. Forgetting the war loophole of all things. Anyways, 2, the idea isn't elimination just yet. Cutting the numbers down, sure, but it's the moral we're going after. It will make her more dangerous, sure, but also enrage her beyond thinking rationally. That and being one of the pillar goddesses in time of war, her temper will have worse results on her own allies, he replied as he formed many, smaller bolts of white lightning as he picked out his targets. Best not to have the other Olympians jump in for backup. What better way than numerous attacks on possible key points for them, such as the locations of hidden weapon stores, armories, and currently empty spots within the camps. With that thought, the siblings watched as the silver dot kept moving westward, zipping past some clouds and over cities without any form of protection. Just before she reaches the Rockies, right? Talia asked as she started to pull her arrow back. He hummed as he narrowed his eyes and spread the mini bolts further apart. Wait for it, oh, and try not to one-shot Artemis out of this whole war either. Talia grumbled something about patience and his unnecessary talking, making him smirk slightly. Don't miss, he quipped just as Artemis was leaving the border of Kansas and into Colorado. Talia released the shot with a whip-like crack, the bolt parting through the atmosphere and the few clouds in that way. That's the thing, little bro, Talia said as she gave him a sidelong glance. I don't miss. Hunter Kelly. Kelly squinted her eyes as the winds pulled at her hair, standing right behind Artemis as her new lieutenant of the hunt. Artemis kept her sight forward on the reins, constantly urging her reindeer to go faster even as half the hunt gripped that mere ropes along the edges of the sleigh in death grips. As they passed over the middle of nowhere, otherwise known as Kansas, Kelly couldn't help but get a troubled feeling. Ever since that meeting just days ago, Olympus and the camps had been a wreck. Anyone having even a slightly positive view of Ares, the amount actually surprised her, were akin to rabid dogs at the moment, and plenty were calling for justice on Lady Hestia's behalf as well. Having Deimos bedridden and in shock for 2 straight days, having lost his shield arm and driving Phobos into a rage had only increased the panic and near hysteria. Now the gods were trying to rapidly move the demigods to one location, having chosen that Camp Jupiter and New Rome were far more suitable. However, not wanting to risk possible exhaustion through flashing all the campers and supporting satyrs when attacks from Umbra could come at any minute, the gods had each taken turns making trips with campers. Artemis and Apollo, having some of the fastest non-teleportation methods of the present gods, had made a schedule to alternate on their nightly trips. That was why, along with the 22 hunters, there was also nearly 15 added campers on Artemis' extended sleigh. Now though they were out and in the open, and Kelly was not liking how her gut decided pulling crunches at this time was in any way helpful. "My lady," she called over the roaring winds, though luckily Artemis heard her somehow. "Yes?" she asked with a glance over her shoulder, her once empty blue-silver eyes burning with indignant fury ever since being speared through by Umbra. "How much longer will it be before we arrive?" she asked, wanting to get out of the open skies as soon as possible. "Less than an hour," she replied before turning to face the battering winds. Kelly bit her lower lip as she glanced back again, making sure none of the campers, females obviously, had somehow fallen off in the time it took for that small exchange. Wouldn't be the first time someone, usually a new hunter, fell off during a ride on the sleigh. However, her inspections were cut short as she heard a distant rumble overhead. It seemed that Artemis heard it too, as both looked up only for their eyes to widen at Bolt heading their way. "Get down!" Artemis roared over the winds as she violently jerked the reins to turn out of the way, too late. "Artemis!" she screamed as the bolt struck right through the front of the sleigh, grazing the goddess, right side and destabilizing the sleigh. Several of the hunters and campers screamed as Artemis, bleeding from her right side with her right arm hanging limp, trying to regain the reins, but it was no use as the sleigh took a dive with the panicking deer. Kelly watched in horror as the beginnings of the Rockies and forest rapidly approached them, her stomach dropping and ears popping painfully at the sudden drop in pressure. The crack of wood and metal tipped her off that the sleigh wouldn't hold much longer as it was, some of the deer pulling off when their harnesses were strained beyond hold. "We're gonna die," Kelly suddenly thought as she looked at the ground less than 1,000 feet away and getting closer. They were going too fast and Artemis couldn't pull them up. Only enough she felt no fear at the realization, only cold resignation and detachment. Her last moments were amusement of all things as Artemis suddenly turned to her, horror flashing in her eyes, before the goddess pulled her into a tight embrace. Kelly smiled at that, almost remembering the days when Artemis was so much kinder before the Second Giant War's conclusion. "It was an honor, my lady." Crash. D.A. Chapter 90. Hunter turned hunted too. Only enough she felt no fear at the realization, only cold resignation and detachment. Her last moments were amusement of all things as Artemis suddenly turned to her, horror flashing in her eyes, before the goddess pulled her into a tight embrace. Kelly smiled at that, almost remembering the days when Artemis was so much kinder before the Second Giant War's conclusion. "It was an honor, my lady." Crash. P. Quote, quote. K. Nay, ease. K. Up. WWHA. Kelly's eyes blurred open as something roughly shook her shoulder. It took all of 3 seconds before the pain of having her form shaken registered as she gasped, only for more pain to flare. Whoever was shaking her luckily stopped as Kelly blinked back the tears and tried to get a hold of her surroundings. She noticed that while being shaken she had been moved into a sitting-up position and reclining against a tree. The beat-up face of Sahara, another hunter, looked at her in worry. "Kelly?" Sahara asked hesitantly as she wriggled her hands nervously, her own forehead bleeding over the left side. "Yes," she replied, wincing as she adjusted slightly before tenderly placing her hand just below her left breast and gasped slightly again. "At least one broken rib and another fractured. Do you think you can stand?" Sahara asked before the brunette glanced over her shoulder. "I think we're trying to group together before moving out and hopefully finding some cover." Kelly followed her line in sight to see a long trench with broken trees some meters away with hunters and campers alike moving towards Artemis as the goddess splinted the leg for one of the joining campers. It seemed her own injury had healed enough to use both arms but just barely since Kelly could see Artemis grimace with every move of her right side. Kelly then did a quick scan of all the hunters and campers present, marveling at the fact that none seemed to have died. "Any losses?" She asked as she bit her lip and forced herself to her feet before stumbling until Sahara got underneath her right arm to support her. Oddly enough, no, Sahara replied with a slight shake of the head before frowning as she looked to the totaled sleigh. It's weird though. The ground around that trench the sleigh made was soft, unusually so. Not enough to avoid the broken bones though, Kelly muttered as they limped together towards the group. They reached them in a minute or so, Kelly cursing her injuries all the while though thankful that her apparent end had not come just yet. Maybe she could get another hug after this was all over. That sounded nice. Still, the hunters stood silently as Artemis finished with the camper who was then supported by another older-looking camper. Thank goodness none that came were younger than 13, hunters withstanding considering all current members were at least a decade old or more since joining the hunt, but now they needed to get a move on. One bolt came down and there was nothing saying another couldn't follow soon. Everyone gathered. Artemis called as she looked them over, her parka matted with ichor and a new cut running the length of her left thigh. She got murmurs of agreement from all. Plenty of bruises and some broken bones but all travel-worthy as far as demigods went. Artemis nodded on approval before she tilted her head up and narrowed her eyes at the sky in the mountain's direction. She kept staring for a minute as the girls got restless before she muttered, "Something isn't right." Before Kelly could even ask, there was another bolt of lightning struck, making plenty of the girls shriek before rain started pouring on them. Kelly stared up at the newly formed rain clouds in shock, knowing that it had been clear not even a minute ago. There was no way this downpour wasn't divine in nature, but who the Hades? Did something make Lord Zeus angry? Sahara asked beside her as she furiously blinked away the rain batting at their eyes. This wasn't father, Artemis answered for her as she looked around, her bow already in hand. At once all the hunters, even Kelly though the pain was practically killing her, drew their bows with arrows at the ready. The campers present also pulled out their weapons, mainly swords and some bows, as they circled up, but the rain was being a bitch to see through. Nothing could be heard aside from the rain as well, and with every second passing the temperature kept dropping. Wait, colder. She wondered as she breathed out and saw her breath misting over. Before she could question it, there was a loud thud making her jump as she looked at Artemis' feet to see a pitch-black arrow missing her foot by inches. Artemis aimed her bow in the direction the arrow came from and let loose a silvery arrow. The other hunters aimed in that direction, but they couldn't see more than a dozen or so feet in any direction with the rain and dark clouds eating up all the light. Did you get it? One of the campers asked nervously while holding a bronze sword in trembling hands. Another arrow passing close enough to cut the cheek of the girl who'd spoken was the answer to that. More arrows soon followed as the girls ducked and covered, but they couldn't pinpoint where the arrows were coming from. Run. We're too open, Artemis ordered as she fired a salvo into the direction of the black arrows. The hunters hesitated, but Artemis sent them a writhing glare that got them moving along with the campers in the middle of them. As they moved, Kelly glanced back to her mistress along with Sahara, only for their eyes to widen as they saw a black blur come out from the trees on her blind side. Lady Artemis. They screamed as a horse-sized black wolf bodily tackled the goddess into another patch of tightly packed trees, their forms being hidden in the rain and darkness. Sahara pulled to a stop and was about to turn, but Kelly grabbed her shoulder and jerked her forward. We have to help her. Sahara shouted, but Kelly was having none of it. Our lady can handle one oversized mutt. We need to move like she said and she'll catch up, Kelly returned as she started to move again, fighting through the pain as they caught up to the larger group of girls, keeping pace for the campers, Sahara following close behind. Stick together. She shouted over the downpour as the girls burst through thick foliage and ducked around trees. They moved in near silence for over 10 minutes as Kelly kept glancing around to see if Artemis had caught up, but there was no sign of the goddess. Boom. Kelly stumbled slightly as the earth and forest shook around them, her eyes darting back to the direction of Artemis, but before she could voice any concerns her blood ran cold as she noticed several large black blurs moving just within the fields of her vision. A pack, she thought in horror as she turned to the group of girls that had paused with the sudden miniature earthquake. Keep moving, there are wolves on our tail. She shouted, getting several alarmed looks as the girls started to really haul ass. Kelly fell into the back as she kept an arrow notched and watched their flanks, but then a hunter screamed as she fell to the side, a black arrow buried in her side. Before anyone could go to help her, the hunter was silenced as another arrow buried itself in her throat. The sound of the hunter, Natalie if Kelly could see right, gurgling and drowning in her own blood, sounding oddly clear even through the rain and occasional thunder clap. More arrows followed, forcing the tightly knit group to disperse into clumps or alone, many shouting in freight and some firing random arrows back into the trees. Kelly was back to back with Sahara, the younger hunter trembling as she looked around wildly. Kelly turned her attention to an enraged shout and saw another one of their hunters standing a few meters away while firing up into the treetops. Dana, over here. Kelly called to her, getting the blonde hunter's attention. The hunter nodded and ran at them, taking all of 3 steps before a black blur tackled her right into the bushes across from Kelly and Sahara. Dana. They both screamed as they ran to the thrashing bushes and Dana's screaming. Kelly tripped over some mud though and fell to her knees just a few feet away, looking at the bushes before water suddenly splashed in her face along with Dana's screams being cut off. She furiously wiped away at the liquid only to notice it was leaving her eyesight hazy. She glanced at her hand wondering if there had been mud on it only to stop cold at the sight. That hadn't been water splashed into her face, but blood. She looked back to the now silent bush, one bloodied and dirty hand sticking out from under the leaves but nothing else. Kelly swallowed thickly as she turned away from the bush and looked to the others girls, her own hands shaking on her bow. A quick count of the hunters she could see already told her at least 3 were missing and another was pinned by the forehead to the tree right behind her. More arrows rained down as the girls started to well and truly panic, making them run again as another hunter was picked off with an arrow to the knee. Kelly glanced back only to see 2 wolves pounce on the girl and drag her into the shadows as she screamed and cried for help, but they couldn't do anything already. Kelly's attention was brought forward again, seeing as their numbers started to dwindle before a searing pain in her right shoulder made her cry out and buckle to the left, knocking Sahara down with her. They both fell to a halt, getting separated from the routed group of hunters and demigods. Kelly. Sahara shouted as she moved around to see the arrow buried right in her shoulder along the rotator cuff. This looks back, she muttered while Kelly resisted screaming, no shit. She grit her teeth through it though, having suffered far worse pain in her 2 centuries of being a hunter. Sahara didn't give her a warning though as she grabbed the shaft and pulled it with a meaty squelch as Kelly couldn't stop the scream this time around. Sahara cringed at it as she tossed the damn arrow away before holding Kelly while trying to check the opening. Oh no, Sahara gasped in horror making Kelly look at her in further alarm. Catching her eye, Sahara swallowed before murmuring, "You're freezing." Kelly could have sworn her heart paused for a good 3 seconds as she digested those words, the gravity of her situation setting in along with probable shock leaving her numb to the once blaring pain. She couldn't even speak as she slowly looked at her shoulder while pulling back the torn sleeve of her parka, seeing the already bluish flesh of the hole left by the arrow and watched it slowly spread like a living virus eating at her skin. She'd gotten the accounts from Athena just the other night when the goddess came to the camp to tell the campers the plan and answered questions about Deimos and Percy's sword. If this was the same curse. Seemingly reading her thoughts, Sahara brought out a knife, the silvery edge glinting with a sudden crack of lightning as her fellow hunter's eyes narrowed with determination. What are you? Cutting the cursed flesh out, Sahara replied as she aimed the knife point. Are you crazy? Kelly shouted as she backed away. The arrow went to the deep muscle, there's no way we're getting that out. I'm not losing you too. Sahara returned with a desperate glint in her eyes. I'm already dead. Kelly shouted back, tears streaming down her face. Just go and catch up with the others before it's too late. Sahara shook her head as her lips started to quiver, the knife falling out of her grip. No, she whimpered as Kelly tried to shove her to move. Why? You have a chance, just go. Kelly shouted at her but Sahara shook her head again. Why are you staying with me? She just couldn't get this girl. It was one thing if she was just hurt and needed help moving, it was another being afflicted with a freezing curse that even Apollo couldn't heal. I won't, Sahara murmured as she griped Kelly's shoulders, making the lieutenant look into her light blue eyes. I won't leave you because I low. Squelch. Kelly blinked. And then blinked again, the sight not properly registering in her mind as she looked at Sahara. Said hunter was looking wide-eyed back at her, her face paling as blood started to pour through her parted lips. As if in sync both looked down to see a black-scaled tail of all things impaled just below her sternum, through her back and out her front. Sahara coughed slightly as the tail end twitched before slowly rising, taking Sahara with it as Kelly watched in numb shock, unable to even muster the strength to grab her down bow or even move more than looking at her fellow hunter. The long black tail curled around as it held the hunter up to a tree just above them, the body of it going into the shadows of the leaves before a low, near seductive giggle rang through even the sound of the rain. Kelly watched in horror as a woman's upper body connected to the snake body at the hips leaned out of the tree. Black hair cascading down to her back, deep blue eyes with narrowed pupils, a small grin with glinting fangs, all decorating a flawlessly creamy skin. topped with a black corset that teased bountiful cleavage and a large black bow in hand. A beautiful death if ever there was one. D.A. Chapter 91, Hunter Turned Hunted 3. Kelly watched in horror as a woman's upper body connected to the snake body at the hips leaned out of the tree. Black hair cascading down to her back, deep blue eyes with narrowed pupils, a small grin with glinting fangs, all decorating a flawlessly creamy skin. Topped with a black corset that teased bountiful cleavage and a large black bow in hand. A beautiful death if ever there was one. Kelly watched as the monster any demigod should recognize, Lamia, pulled Sahara in and gave the hunter a full-on kiss. She watched, minutely aware that her entire right arm was useless and the frostbite was spreading to her collarbone. She watched as Sahara's skin paled at the lips to a light blue with black streaks at a far faster rate than the curse left by the arrow. Within seconds the frostbite spread and from underneath Sahara's parka what was visible of her belly and arms was already freezing. It took no more than a minute until Lamia pulled back from the kiss, idly licking the blood acquired on her own lips before looking to Kelly and smirking. I guess one little kiss was a too much for the pretty hunter, Lamia teased before glancing at the frozen corpse still impaled on her tail. Oh well, she wasn't much anyways. With that Lamia dismissively looked away as her tail flexed, shattering Sahara at the middle and leaving her halves to crash onto the floor and breaking into even smaller chunks. What about you, Lieutenant? Lamia asked her as she lowered herself more after glancing at the little tiara still somehow on Kelly's head. Kelly couldn't find a voice to reply as a number of wolves suddenly came from within the trees, each at least as large as a horse if not larger. All had icy blue eyes and oddly enough white fangs tipped with the same blue coloration. Again that resignation, the very same as when they were falling from the skies, came to her. Detached, devoid of dignity or pride in her last moments with her body beginning to shut down. My lady will come for revenge, Kelly murmured as the last of her strength simply started to seep away as the cold came to claim her. Lamia leaned even closer, the sweet scent of mint wafting through her lips as she looked into Kelly's eyes. That's what we're hoping for, she whispered as her tail reared up again, the end pointed straight at Kelly's head. But don't worry, you'll be seeing your sisters again, in Tartarus. Lamia's tail lunged forward and Kelly knew no more. Artemis, minutes earlier. She shot arrow after arrow into the downpour, her godly sense being the only way she knew an enemy was even in the direction of the mountain. Still, even with her sight she could not make out more than blurred figures looking relatively humanoid. She could hear her hunters already running as she ordered. Now I can focus on finding our attacker, she thought grimly. Artemis. The goddess glanced back to see why her lieutenant had called out to her but her eyes widened as a massive black wolf tackled her. The wind was knocked out of her as she was sent tumbling through the trees. Pain flared through her injured side but she managed to push through it as she straightened herself in midair and landed on her feet even as the momentum carried her several more feet. Once at a stop she dematerialized her bow in favor of drawing her silver knives, each one measuring close to 2 feet and screaming for blood. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the wolf that had tackled her, unable to shake the feeling that the wolf was familiar somehow. Unlike Umbra, who'd been pure black and had gleaming, icy blue eyes, this she-wolf had yellow silvery eyes and red fringes along her back and sides. However, the power coming off the wolf was nothing to scoff at. Hell, she was ashamed that she failed to notice the presence of such an obviously strong threat. The she-wolf ducked her head and growled, the sound making the small clearing they were in to rumble as the downpour seemed to increase and the temperature dropped to the point even Artemis was getting uncomfortable. They stared off for several seconds before the she-wolf suddenly stopped the growl and just lunged without preamble. Artemis wasn't the mistress of the hunt for nothing though as she rolled out of the wolf's way and got back into position. The moment the wolf landed Artemis attacked, swinging her knives in a deadly arc but the she-wolf showed incredible agility for being so large, pivoting on her back paws and jumping just an inch too far off the knife edges. The she-wolf didn't stop there as she lunged with an open maw to which Artemis swung her right knife at. To her shock the she-wolf reacted in time and bit down on the knife, stopping it dead as the pair locked eyes. If it hadn't been for the clearly life or death struggle going on Artemis would have stopped to contemplate the absolute contempt within the she-wolf's eyes. It was as if she'd done some unspeakable horror to the wolf, like murder her pups or something. She couldn't have time to think on it though as the she-wolf bit down harder and much to Artemis' shock, started to form cracks on her daggers. Those were Atlantean silver gifted to her by her uncle and nothing short of two gods clashing at full force should have been able to so much as chip them. Thinking quickly, she struck with her other knife, but the she-wolf let go before the knife could run through her head, but not fast enough to avoid Artemis lashing out with a kick, nailing the she-wolf in the chest. The blow sent the she-wolf careening through a few trees as Artemis pursued it, intent on finishing it as quickly as possible. She caught sight of the she-wolf quick enough and lunged with her undamaged knife, intent on stabbing the recovering wolf. Her perception allowed her to see as the knife edge sliced through the falling rain as the she-wolf looked up with widening eyes, as if realizing the opening and preparing to evade. But it was too late, and a grin broke Artemis' face as she watched with glee as the knife got closer. A foot, 8 inches, 4 inches, 1 in, clang. Artemis could only blink dumbly, barely registering an obsidian black knife just barely blocking her own knife before a boot-covered leg slammed into her gut. She gasped with the explosion of pain as she was sent skidding back and looked to who interrupted her attack only to stare in surprise. Feral green eyes within a coppery-toned face, glossy black hair instead of the pit of vipers it was cursed to be, dressed in a tight, sleeveless back dress barely reaching mid-thigh. Thigh-high, heeled leather boots and elbow-length gloves with equally obsidian bracers on her forearms, and lastly, 2 pitch black, barbed blades connected to a smooth chain. Medusa? She asked in shocked surprise. The monster in human form didn't give her a response, instead glancing back to the recovered she-wolf. You still lack enough experience, Lupa, she said, shocking Artemis yet again as she looked at the she-wolf in a new light. You forget that Artemis belongs to a significantly higher tier of opponents than what you've faced alone in either of your forms. The revealed Lupa lowered her ears before she was consumed in shadows only to step out as a human in a similar dress and armor to Medusa without the knives. Artemis noted how similar the pair looked now, and even their signatures, both of which were heavily divine now that she had a moment to really study them. But that means, Lupa is a traitor, Artemis thought with rising fury. How dare she? After everything Artemis did for her, saving her from the council millennia ago and not revealing her human form lest she be taken and passed around the mountain like a cheap whore. And for what? This betrayal. No. She would not let this insult stand. If the bitch wanted to run off to some damn demon or whatever the Hades Umbra is, fine, Artemis will send her in a matchbox. With that in mind, Artemis started to gather her essence into her core. She felt her body toughen, her injuries healing faster, her strength and speed increasing as her body started to glow. That got both Medusa and Lupa's attention, and Artemis couldn't help but smirk at them, getting ready to show them why you don't piss off a goddess of her caliber. She kept gathering her essence and was already past the half point until suddenly she felt a barrier she hadn't noticed before increase in strength. As soon as the barrier became apparent, she was cut off from increasing her power anymore, and regardless of how hard she tried, she couldn't call in more power. She even lost contact with her Roman form, Diana, which was waiting for her in New Rome. She tried flashing, and to her horror, that was cut off as well. By the matching grins Lupa and Medusa were sporting, they knew it as well. Looks like Master has decided to spring the trap, Medusa purred as she took a step forward. Go and meet with our Lord Lupa, I'll handle the goddess. Lupa looked like she wanted to protest, but they tilted her head as if to hear something better. She pouted suddenly and then, much to Artemis' confusion, dissolved into shadows, leaving her alone with Medusa. So, ready to play? Medusa asked as she lazily twirled one of her blades by the chain. Do you really think you can face me, monster? Artemis asked as she readied her knives. She may have been cut off from her full power, but she'd still managed to get over half. I don't think, Medusa quipped before suddenly lunging forward in a burst of shadow only to materialize in front of Artemis. I know. D.A. Chapter 92, Hunter Turned Hunted IV. Do you really think you can face me, monster? Artemis asked as she readied her knives. She may have been cut off from her full power, but she'd still managed to get over half. I don't think, Medusa quipped before suddenly lunging forward in a burst of shadow only to materialize in front of Artemis. I know. Quicker than Artemis expected, Medusa slammed a fist into Artemis' gut, doubling her over and making her spit up ichor, but Medusa wasn't anywhere finished with that. The very force of the blow blew the rain away around them before Medusa kept pushing up and unceremoniously launched Artemis skyward. She only got to glance up at the dark and stormy clouds before she felt a bitingly cold chain wrap around her waist. She couldn't even see before she was violently tugged down only to meet the unforgivingly hard ground. Boom. The size of a small pool formed around Artemis, along with setting off a miniature earthquake, her entire body screaming in protest of the pain as her vision went in and out of focus. She could hear her own blood pumping, water pooling around her as she fought through the pain to take stock of her injuries. A flash of pain in her lower back was not a good sign at all. Hello. Medusa called mockingly as she leaned over the edge and looked at Artemis with unrestrained glee. Don't tell me that was all you had, Artie. For shame. Keep this up and there won't be a hunt left to go back to. What did she? Artemis gasped as she felt it. One of her hunters just died. She focused on her link to them for a moment and that was all she needed to feel their panic and fear. There were some in pain too, their desperate prayers for help coming to her before some were violently silenced. Artemis felt tears stinging at her eyes before her fury returned as she looked at the grinning Medusa. How dare that bitch taunt her as her hunters were killed? Her anger knew no bounds as she grit her teeth and started to get up, ignoring her body's protests. I'm going to skin you alive, Artemis growled as she forced herself to her feet even as a faint crack sounded from her back. Her hair was matted with ichor, her clothes in tatters, and one of her knives looked like it was close to breaking, but she didn't care in the slightest. All that mattered was making Medusa suffer, so with that in mind, Artemis pumped the power of her gathered essence she'd managed to collect from her core into her muscles and senses. Her body partially healed and strengthened even further with her conscious effort to turn it into offensive capabilities. Her eyes were visibly glowing as she looked at the now stoic Medusa, said monster tightening her grip on her knives. Artemis kept their gazes locked for another few seconds before her legs twitched. As if dual bullets finally fired, they launched at each other with knives ready. They met in a mighty clash, sparks flying as Artemis glared into the eyes of Medusa. They didn't speak as they separated only for a second before meeting again. Artemis swiped her knives, every strike lethal in nature, but Medusa expertly kept tab with each, using not only the knives but the chains to block and deflect every attack. It was a dance of death with sparks being the only marker of their blades clashing as they moved throughout the clearing. One moment Artemis was ducking as Medusa lashed out with a roundhouse kick, smashing through the tree that had been behind the goddess. The next Artemis recovered, brought her knives together into an X fashion to cut Medusa's exposed back, but in the nick of time the monster brought a chain up taut, stopping her knives flat. Artemis didn't pause though, even as she felt another hunter die, making her angrier. She rolled to the side, avoiding an overhead kick that caused another small explosion of pressure, pushing away the rain from the combating duo. This is ridiculous, Artemis thought as her hands shook from holding the knives for so long with the impact. Medusa's strength was about on par with that of Hercules before he became a god, and even then his strength was monstrous. The fact that Medusa was keeping up with her, the strongest goddess of Olympus, by a slight margin over Athena, was blood-curdling. If Umbra had even a dozen fighters capable of this level of combat, without including himself, then this war was going to be nothing short of a bloodbath. Food for thought, goddess. Medusa quipped as she jumped over Artemis and spun around for a kick which Artemis blocked with the back of her wrist. A decision that she was coming to regret quickly, judging by the throbbing pain following it. Just shut up, she spat venomously as she reversed the grip on her knives and lunged forward, missing Medusa's hip by the skin of her teeth. Oh come now, no playful banter. Medusa asked as she backflipped out of Artemis' range. Geez, so uptight. Tell me, was the eternal maiden thing by choice or was it because no guy could stand you long enough to bother getting into your panties? Shut up. She bellowed as she threw a wild hook from her right, crushing the boulder that had been behind Medusa. Only lover you found was a girl literally stuck with you via oath, can that count as a marriage making you a widow? Medusa asked with a giggle even as she threw her left knife too quick for Artemis to properly track. It sliced past her shoulder with a chilling sting. You're so lucky, my freezing curse is minor compared to my lord's. How is Deimos, by the way? Artemis ignored her as she jumped back for some distance before she pressed a hand over the stinging cut, blasting it with a wave of raw divine energy and basically cauterizing the cut while nullifying the curse. How did you know about him? Artemis asked through grit teeth as she returned to a combat pose. Oh, we have our ways, was the cryptic reply. Just as we knew that you and your baby brother are planning on running a taxi service for the little whelps. They know. How? Is there another traitor? Artemis wondered before she rushed forward with a flurry of slashes. Medusa parried most but a few got through, cutting Medusa's cheek and the lower end of her ribs to the left side, making the monster click her teeth in irritation. Artemis kept the pressure though and jumped, her knee flying forward, forcing Medusa to block it, but she was too late and Artemis' knee struck her cheek, the force sending her skidding back. Artemis landed back with a slight smirk, pleased at finally getting some damage on the monster woman. Medusa was surprisingly strong, but in the end, there were gaps in power between the monstrous and divine that Medusa couldn't hope to match. Besides, it was only a matter of time before the other Olympians noticed Artemis disappearing if they hadn't already and breaking down the barrier. Then Artemis would unleash her full fury on Medusa and make sure the bitch wouldn't reform for a century at least. With that in mind, she focused on the oddly silent monster before her eyes widened at the sight. Where she expected the usual dark, nearly black blood of wounded monsters, Medusa's was golden just like hers. Artemis gasped, unable to understand how was it that Medusa had ichor running through her veins. Too caught up in her surprise, she barely noticed that Medusa suddenly closed the distance to her. "You really shouldn't get distracted, little goddess," Medusa said, her voice devoid of the prior mirth. Before Artemis could react, Medusa spun on her heel and delivered a devastating kick to Artemis' gut, an audible snap and pressure wave erupting off the contact before she was launched several meters through trees and rocks alike before finally crashing into the muddy ground. Artemis gasped for air as she turned over and got onto wobbly feet, her head spinning as she started to lean more to her left side. She was about to turn when she screamed as one of Medusa's knives pierced her shin from behind, dropping the goddess to her knees. She heard Medusa's steps over the rain and tried to muster the strength to stand, but after pushing herself to the limits imposed by the barrier, she was nearly spent. She couldn't stop another scream as the knife was violently ripped out before a hand grabbed her hair and yanked her face up. "My lord," she heard Medusa purr as Artemis forced her eyes open to a surprising sight. Merely a few feet in front of her was Lupa, still in her human form, but what was more surprising was the tall man besides her looking down at Artemis coldly. He wore a hooded coat reaching to the back of his thighs that seemed to writhe with darkness, only his lower jaw and strange, flaming black eyes with icy pupils were visible to her. Looking into those eyes so full of utter hatred directed at her made her shiver, feeling so weak and vulnerable beneath his gaze. "Umbra," she tried to growl, but it came out almost as a whimper, unsure of just how she knew, but those eyes immediately connected to that name. He didn't speak, as if she was unworthy of even being acknowledged by him beyond simply being looked at. How it stung her already wounded pride, but her body was exhausted at this point, her energy taking a dip with every hunter she felt die. He gave her a once-over before shaking his head and turning away, showing Artemis another shocking feature. Feathered wings, so dark that they seemed to drain the last dregs of light left underneath the raging storm, and radiating a cold that even at a slight distance she could feel it numbing her face. Umbra spread them, squatting his knees slightly before blasting off into the darkened skies and with a mighty beat, burst into darkness without a trace. Artemis kept her eyes on the spot Umbra disappeared before she looked to Lupa as she shuffled closer. "I don't know whether you were lucky or not that the master didn't want to kill you yet," she said with a sigh before glaring down at Artemis. "But your time will come, little hunter," she spat with disgust while raising her fist. "This is for every Roman demigod killed before his time thanks to your misguided judgment and that band of barbarians you tug around. Pups that I reared and trained to make New Rome proud. Say hi to your family for me." Then her fist struck Artemis right across the temple, jarring her skull as Medusa released her hair. She fell limp, unable to get back up. She was tired, cold, hurt, and scared. Nearly out of sight, she watched as Medusa and Lupa walked away, dissolving into shadow just like their master had. Idly she felt the barrier disappear and only moments later felt the arrival of several Olympians, her father and brother yelling for her. She felt them getting closer, heard their footsteps splashing in the rain and mud, before unconsciousness took her. POV. Closing parenthesis. From his throne he sat, watching as servants and advisors alike moved about before him. They muttered lowly, none daring to raise their eyes to him, as was their place. Diminutive and weak, but useful in their own ways. Yet, it was the fact that he needed them to act as proxies for the time being that enraged him. Titans, his siblings in a sense, being born after the cataclysm to his mother, Gaia. At least these ones had some modicum of power and intelligence unlike his other siblings, the elder Cyclops and hundred-handed ones. To think that their mightiest had been the incomplete fool known as Typhon. Why his mother ever even tolerated the reject's existence he would never know. At least that was one thing that new council, those usurpers, had done right in ridding the world of that stain. Regardless, he would see them cut down soon enough. Their mercy and unwillingness to fight at full power in order to spare the mortal world would be their undoing. For now though, it would simply do to gain some more fodder and maybe a few key individuals. With that in mind, he turned his gaze to the far side of his massive throne room, spotting a particular man studying over a world map. "Koyos," he called, his voice booming with authority, making the man straighten up and turn to him. He was tall in his natural form, towering at 20 feet without even assuming his divine form. Coppery skin, startlingly bright green eyes, a trimmed, black beard to match his short-cut hair along his sculpted jawline. Broad-chested and well-muscled, dressed simply in a white tunic, slacks, and Dracon leather boots. Koyos, titanic god of heavenly bodies and intellect, one of his newest and best strategists. You called, my lord, Koyos replied, looking troubled in having to address him as such. No matter, he'll learn proper loyalty soon enough, the lord thought as he waved the titan over. Tell me, how favorable would the previously discussed alliance work? He asked as he leaned down slightly to loom over the smaller god. With the recent attack on the Olympians, it would seem that Poseidon would be more open to negotiation, Koyos replied dutifully. His armies are still gathering, though there is rumor of discontent amongst his court, and the presence of Oceanus on the edges of his territory is causing a stir with some of the merfolk. Waiting would have two possible outcomes. Either he allies to us and calms his people while focusing on the new council, or he goes against, which could lead to a civil war if Oceanus pushes further, using the already tense court of sea nobles against Poseidon, but that would result in loss of potential forces and resources for us. What a choice, he murmured as he scratched his long beard, his swirling blue eyes moving to look through the crystal ceiling of his throne room. Above he could see all manner of sea life swimming across the frigid waters of the north, the occasional whale or monster passing overhead. Send an emissary under a white banner and tell Oceanus to come here. We will try to parley, but if negotiations fail then we can get a little more aggressive, he continued before glancing down at Koyos. The Titan gave a curt bow and turned to leave, milling through the throngs of servants as they raced about to give maps, messages, and even food to his gathered military heads. He watched this all, his thoughts already planning on how to move Poseidon to his side. D.A. Chapter 93. Betrayals and Please I. Leo Pav. Leo watched as the crowd whispered and stole glances to the gathered thrones, some in disbelief, the ballsy ones in pity, though they were quick to hide it lest they be seen and possibly smite for it. He could understand though, he really could, considering he would have been in their shoes nearly a decade ago. It had been just over 3 days since the Moonlight Massacre as it was come to be known. Artemis had been unresponsive for over a day, and off all her hunters only 5 remained, though miraculously none of the campers who'd gone in her trip had died. When the goddess returned to the land of the living, she'd been rapidly switching between enraged and heartbroken, having lost all hunters that had been part of her group for millennia and leaving only recent additions. The deaths and the fact that Artemis was defeated so easily, and up until now the goddess had refused to offer more on what happened. With Artemis out of it for the last few days, other gods had to pull the slack and work overtime to flash the remaining demigods of Camp Halfblood to Camp Jupiter, and the Amazons had arrived just last night. With the overflowing city, tempers and anxiety were rising high, but Zeus had put his foot down for order, along with the help of Athena and Hephaestus. Now they had called another war council, this time filled with senior members of every branch and grouping. At the center of the council chamber sat the thrones of the gods, the tops of both Greek and Roman pantheon for the few that were exclusive to one or the other. Leo sat next to his wife, Calypso, within the audience seating rather in the lower tables. He might be a veteran of the Second Giant War and now god, but he was never suited for being in the commanding positions, as was far more content to give input if asked, otherwise he would focus on arming them up as best he could. Leo was broken out of his thoughts when Zeus slammed an electrified fist onto his armrest, discharging a wave of static and ruining more than one hairdo. So not cool. With the silence restored and all eyes on him, Zeus began the Second War Council. Now then, he began after scanning around. It would seem that this Umbra has gone and revealed more of himself, along with the possible location of his base, and we can assure of some gods that have betrayed. The crowd and representatives started to murmur at that, eyeing the king nervously as he waved to Artemis. Artemis can confirm it, Lupa has in fact turned traitor. That caused an uproar with the Roman demigods and those who saw her in a favorable light. It lasted for nearly a minute before Artemis shot to her feet and roared, "Enough." Silence reigned again as all eyes turned to the near-rabid goddess. Without a word she waved her hand, causing an orb to appear high overhead, and only a few seconds later an image appeared of a large black wolf with yellow-silver eyes. Like a mini-clip it played forward, and they watched in stunned silence as Artemis was about to stab the wolf before being interrupted by a raven beauty. Leo would have, pun intended, wolf whistled if the situation wasn't so grave. His jaw dropped at the revelation of Medusa, where the Hades did her snake hair go. And then Lupa of all things turned into a chick, a very fine chick if he said so himself. The image suddenly cut off and then changed to Artemis' view, making Leo wonder if the goddess didn't want them seeing how she got her ass handed to her. Leo didn't see the point considering how trashed she was when they recovered her alone with the survivors of the trip. After all, Leo had seen enough of the goddess throughout the decade to know she would have gloated if she managed to take down even one of her attackers, and considering it was a goddess, a monster god too, and a demon responsible for several disappearances and deaths, Artemis was laughably outgunned. When the playing image focused on Umbra, revealing a somewhat human form for the first time, several murmurs broke out. It got even louder when they saw him turn to reveal his wings, and one particularly loud gasp drawing his attention. His eyes focused on the centurion for the second cohort, a daughter of Venus if he recalled properly. Normally he would ogle such beauties but on the sly, otherwise Calypso kicked him to the dreaded couch, but what caught his interest was the fact that she was holding a small cross in her knuckle as if a lifeline. A Christian demigod. Now he's seen everything. What's more, he could read her shaky lips as she mumbled to herself about fallen angel and Lucifer. He could see how she would jump to that, considering the resemblance was uncanny. Overly powerful dude calling himself a demon, pitch black wings and power to freeze, especially considering that Lucifer was said to be in the last level of hell, the frozen pit of betrayers. Now Leo was pretty sure the Big G didn't exist, otherwise a good 90% of the Greek pantheon and monsters alike would have been tossed into said pit long ago. Regardless, the comparison was unnerving to say the least. What was next? A white angel with a big-ass sword swapping down and starting to hack gods to pieces. He shuddered with a sudden chill running down his spine, making him look around. He knocked on the wood of his seat, just in case. Thankfully Leo was broken out of his thoughts before it could get too messed up as the orb disappeared and attention returned to the council. They looked just as surprised as the attending demigods, possibly from Artemis remaining silent and apart from everyone until today. It was not looking good though, and Leo had a feeling today's council wasn't bringing good news either. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, we can begin with some plans of defense, Athena spoke up as she stood, and with a wave of her hand another orb appeared detailing the continental US and Canada. There was a bright beacon located in Ontario that Athena pointed to. It seemed that Umbra and his forces have made an appearance, and we can distinctly feel a large amount of divine energy coming from somewhere in northern Ontario. Sadly, it is just beyond the metaphysical border of the land of the gods. So we do nothing. Clarice shouted as she stood, already dressed in war regalia even if not currently armed. I was saying, Athena cut in with a glare that shut the veteran up. It's close. Not enough that we can safely flash there and retain our power, but enough that we can provide support and long-range attacks while a demigod army could safely attack. Therefore, we will start with smaller scouting parties heading north to get a lay for the land. Athena paused as she waved her hand, making the map zoom in closer to see a better picture of the terrain. Considering the heavily woodland and occasional mountainous areas, the primary scouting will be done by satyr and hunter teams, Athena said before stopping as Reyna raised her hand to get the goddess' attention. With Athena's nod, Reyna stood while directing a nervous look at Artemis. But Lady Athena, how will there be hunters if they had such heavy casualties? She asked, and Leo nodded along. The 5 surviving hunters were catatonic after being rescued and would flinch at the shadows. It was a wonder if any of them could return to the battlefield at all. Seeing one of the most elite groups of Olympus so broken had really done a number to the morale of the camp as a whole. We are aware, Athena replied while shooting a calculating look at Artemis as said goddess glared down at her own lap. However, to compensate, she along with all other Olympians will be recruiting demigods and forming elite groups similar to the hunt. Such as? Chiron asked, speaking up as he passed worried looks over the demigods. They were his charges after all, especially with the loss of Lupa. Without Ares, Bellona and I have decided to take up the mantle for primarily warrior-styled demigods, and so will recruit the heavier infantry from the camp, Athena answered while looking over the demigods. Artemis Hunt and another group formed by Hermes will be mainly scouts and used for guerrilla tactics. Apollo will form the archery team and medics, and so on and so forth. And joining a group is not optional, Zeus added as thunder cracked overhead, sending a shiver through the demigod ranks present. Unless of course, you intend to run and turn traitor, Artemis added as she diligently scanned the chambers. Leo nervously swallowed at the look in Artemis' eyes. They were so full of distrust and anger. He knew he was right, the news of these new squads was not going to go over very well. Sure, plenty were itching for war, but basically drafting them into those groups and what was sure to be full of oaths calling loyalties into question would not endear them to the gods. Not to mention the mass movement into unfamiliar terrains. Well, At least he now had an Argo 3, IV, and V to load up rather than leave to collect dust. How lucky was it that none were in any of his father's storages, otherwise they would have been blown to kingdom come with the freaky lightning strikes. Nothing says, hello, and, fuck you, like ballista bolts and Greek fire bombs raining from the heavens. D.A. Chapter 94, Betrayals and Pleas 2. Amphitrite Pav. Same time. She nervously sat in her coral and shell throne within the court as she, along with her husband, waited for the envoy said to be coming to offer them support in this new war. Amphitrite kept an impassive face as she glanced to the side, watching Poseidon as his scowl grew the longer they waited for said envoy, and just who it was. Even Poseidon had not been able to quell the court once it was learned that her father, Oceanus of all divinity, was coming to Atlantis again. However, the fact that he came under the white banner set off all kinds of alarms in her head. She knew her father, or at least had millennia ago. Not as boisterous as Kronos and generally far more mild-mannered while being a cool-headed warrior in battle but to come as an envoy for someone else. That was not something her father had ever done, even during the rule of Kronos. Oceanus was still a proud being and to willingly concede authority to another was worrying. Just who could make the master of the oceans to bend his knees? Her thoughts remained in turmoil as she distantly noticed the arrivals. Some Telchines stood as honor guard, their ugly mugs looking around in barely concealed distaste in Poseidon's direction. Amphitrite glanced around the seated court of sea nobles and Oceanids looking intently between Poseidon and the approaching Titan standing at nearly 20 feet. Just like she remembered him, her father walked in a chiton suited to the tastes of Atlantis, made of sea silk in shades of light blue and gold collars, his own skin having a barely noticeable blue hue unlike the green of her mother's, Tethys. His black beard reached just to his collarbone, his deep blue and bronze mixed eyes looking intently at Poseidon as he stepped forward. His eyes passed over Amphitrite for but a moment, but in that moment she saw no true warmth directed towards her. She knew their relationship had always been rocky, with most of the love she'd felt being explicitly maternal, but then with the recent Titan War and their second defeat, one in which Amphitrite stayed decisively with the Olympians, had just about ended any remotely friendly relations that may have remained. It made her heart ache knowing she was becoming more isolated by the day with rising agitation throughout the kingdom. But there might be one, she thought as she discreetly glanced at the pearl hanging from her necklace as Oceanus took a seat across from Poseidon. She looked to the side and saw that her son was also standing on guard in a median space, close enough to intercept a possible attack from Oceanus' escorts and also defend her. Returning her attention to her father and husband, both having exchanged useless pleasantries and now getting to the real goal of the visit. So Poseidon, Oceanus started, expertly hiding his distaste of the god across from him. It seems that you and the other Olympians are facing a new adversary that you aren't ready for. And what do you know of them? Poseidon asked with narrowed eyes. Or are you just here to stir up trouble while my attentions are elsewhere? I could make use of it, but no, this is strictly in regards to your problem, which will unfortunately become ours soon enough, Oceanus retorted. And who exactly is your group? Poseidon asked with a raised eyebrow. In fact, what is it that you want out of all this with me and my kingdom? Someone who is far stronger than either you or I, and without his help, you will never defeat this, Umbra, and his own group. As for what we want, well, for now it is merely a friendly ceasefire and possible cooperation in regards to combating this group. We can bolster your forces exponentially and help hide your movements from the demon. You keep mentioning a he and saying he has knowledge on this group, but you have yet to give me anything substantial, Poseidon returned as he gripped his trident menacingly. Give me a name, or otherwise I know you're giving empty promises. Oceanus smirked, his eyes drawing up the god across from him while Amphitrite felt the unease within her grow. She already had an idea of who Umbra's group consisted of, considering she met Jason, even if she wasn't sure what they were exactly. All she knew was they were far beyond any demigod, and judging by the reports on Artemis' defeat, they had several powerful warriors to their banner. Sadly, even she was completely unprepared for the name Oceanus dropped as his bait. Pontus. She, along with many in the court, gasped, a feeling of overwhelming pressure stifling their breathing for all of 3 seconds before it disappeared as all fell silent. Oceanus didn't seem bothered at all and openly smirked at Poseidon's suddenly pale complexion as low murmurs started to carry around the court. Amphitrite felt her nervousness increase with every minute that passed and even started to feel cornered when her father glanced at her before looking back to Poseidon. The very oceans themselves are willing to provide aid and give you knowledge the likes of which you could hardly imagine, Oceanus continued while raising a closed fist. The power to finally take over as the kings of this world. All three of us have been forced to bend knee in the presence of our siblings, cowed into subservience while the world was run amok. Now these demons are attacking and the weak Olympians are acting like headless chickens. Oceanus paused as he stood and approached Poseidon while Triton and several of the guards tightened their grips on their weapons but made no move to attack while Poseidon remained stoic. Oceanus stopped a mere few meters away, looking Poseidon in the eyes. You know you were always the strongest of your brothers, second only to your sister, but she was too docile to take the reins. The world is changing, your father is long gone and so is mother, and yet you stand silent as your brother, in his ever-reaching incompetence, concerns himself more with where to stick his cock rather than ruling. Oceanus pressed as he leaned forward. He betrayed you after the first Titan War while I remained neutral, knowing my own brother was in the wrong, and yet I was forced to flee or be imprisoned for simply being what I am. You came to my domain and created your home away from him, but again his follies drag you into them, he continued before cutting his hand across the water in front of him. Well, no more. Take action, Poseidon, join us in reclaiming our world back from pompous gods and man alike. Throughout his speech Poseidon remained silent, his eyes downcast as Amphitrite inched back farther into her throne. She kept glancing between Poseidon and Oceanus, not liking the turn of the conversation at all. Gaia had already wanted to destroy civilization and let her children conquer, which meant putting all of them into damnation as slaves, dead, or worse. And what's more, Oceanus almost whispered as he looked to Amphitrite as he continued, we can help you root out all traitors. Amphitrite felt her heart seize up as Poseidon looked to her in something akin to shock and anger, but she wasn't sticking around to find out what he was going to do. She started to mentally picture one of Hestia's old homes in the mortal world, but then felt a barrier erect itself around the whole of the castle. Several shouted in shock of the feeling until Oceanus raised his hand in silence. Not to worry, that's just to keep traitors contained, he said as Amphitrite threw herself off her throne, willing an Atlantean silver blade to appear in her hand. She turned around and raised her blade just in time to block a thrust from Poseidon's trident, but wasn't able to stop the pommel of her father's sword from nailing her in the gut. She had the ether blown out of her as her body tumbled back through a side of the court, bowling over some sea nobles. They scrambled around as she rolled to her hands and knees, spitting up some ichor before her free hand went to her neck in effort to grab Jason's pearl. However, her hand found nothing. She gasped as she looked past her husband's approach, seeing the necklace at the feet of her throne right next to her son. She met Triton's gaze and her heart nearly broke to see him looking at her in disbelief even as Oceanus spoke while approaching with Poseidon. She thought she was clever, but the oceans can see far. She just so happened to be consorting with one of the demons, rather, enthusiastically, he said as Poseidon's grip on his trident tightened. She grit her teeth as she stood up, her sword at the ready. Why? Poseidon asked as he aimed his trident. I could spend years telling you, and I already have, but it won't matter, she said as she glanced around looking for escape routes, but to her dismay, both Oceanus' guard and Poseidon's were at all of them. I resigned myself to being your arm decoration after being kidnapped, I surrendered the love of my parents after siding with you in the Second War, and now you've become something even I don't recognize. With that she charged forward, her sword swinging down, but Poseidon blocked it with ease, barely even grunting at the pressure that could have crushed a cyclops into paste. He shoved back, forcing her to backpedal before he repeatedly thrusted as she tried to deflect every attack. Sparks sizzled in the water as she lost ground. She felt her arms starting to sting as her muscles protested from disuse. She ducked under a swipe, but just as she was about to bring up her sword, Poseidon lashed out with a kick, striking her in the ribs with an audible snap as she cried out. The blow tossed her into a pillar, smashing the stone structure and having several pieces fall on top of her. Her back started to hurt with the weight, but she ignored it as she forced herself to her feet and was about to try for another attack before she screamed as Poseidon's trident impaled her shoulder to the back wall. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she desperately tried to tug the trident out, but it remained solid as Poseidon approached. He stopped right before her, his face giving nothing away as he reared his fist back. She glanced past him and locked eyes with Triton for a moment. I'm so sorry you had to see this, she thought, seeing the visible struggle in him as he watched his mother and father come to blows. I wish I could see you again, Jason, she thought as Poseidon's fist came down and emptiness became her world. D.A. Chapter 95. Betrayals and Pleas 3. Persephone Pav. Later that evening, the queen of the underworld sighed softly to herself as she looked at her reflection in the vanity, her eyes seeming strange even to herself. Where they were once radiant with hints of bright green within warm pools of brown like the renewed earth of spring, now they seemed faint and gray from lack of sleep and worry. Her hair was cast into a low ponytail and tossed over her left shoulder as she combed the end, trying to steel herself for what she was about to do. Once her hair was combed to her satisfaction, she waved her newly free hand to apply a modest touch of makeup and even focused some of her divine energy into her eyes to make them seem radiant again. Once completing her makeup, she stood and tossed of her bathrobe before putting on a simple, black gown that reached just to her ankles with a slight running up her right leg to the thigh. With a pair of simple, black heels she left her bathroom, stepping into the master bedroom of her palace. She looked to her bed and saw her husband well and truly asleep. A hefty night of eating and drinking a fine wine from Ray's new vineyards after a rather taxing day restructuring the underworld with Nico's assistance had assured her that her husband wouldn't join the world of the living anytime soon. Stepping up to the side of her bed, she leaned down and softly kissed Hades on the forehead, the god mumbling something before turning over in the bed and snoring away. She smiled wistfully before grimacing as she remembered what she needed to do tonight. It weighed heavily in her heart, knowing that the repercussions could be severe for her and several others, but she needed to try. If things went as expected, it might be possible she would never join her husband's bed again, even though she did love him and wanted to stay with him. She prayed to chaos it didn't go as far as to her worst fears, but if necessary. She steeled herself as she swiftly left their chambers and moved on towards the throne room, ignoring the few ghouls and servants traversing the late hours of the castle. She morbidly thought of how the pained wails in the distance had become rather soothing to her after so long, especially when she was nervous. Still, with a slight shake of her head, she arrived to the throne room before mentally picturing the temple of the primordials. One intense flash of golden light and she was gone, only to reappear seconds later just before said temple. She looked up at the rather simple yet imposing sight of the temple, the main doors reaching 5 stories and wide enough for 4 cars to pass comfortably at the same time. Small torches of warm orange and yellow light up the white halls and she walked inside, idly noting how quiet it was, unlike the bustling center of activity it usually was during the day. Her heels clacked throughout the halls as she moved further into the structure before turning down a large hall containing several doors, the offices of primordials. She'd always been interested in going into one, finding the idea of mental plane brought to a physical manifestation rather fascinating, but had never really had the chance even when she swore her domains to Rhea. Well, at least now she might get her chance. With a quick step she arrived to the door she wanted, the wood being ebony as to match the primordial using the space. 2 blades, a katana and a Viking sword, crossed with a black flame being the symbol that let her know she was correct. Mentally focusing on the task at hand and what was at stake, she raised her hand and knocked. It took a few seconds of mind-numbing silence before the door slowly and soundlessly opened, an expanse of pitch darkness beyond. Gulping nervously, she took her first steps into his inner world tentatively, unable to so much as see more than an inch or so in front of her. Once she was past the threshold, the door audibly snapped behind her, making her jump with a start. She turned to see, but everything was pitch black as her heart started to race, her body shuddering as a cool breeze swept over her. Then suddenly, like a switch being flipped, she could see, and all she could do was gasp. Where once an all-consuming darkness was now a majestic forest of ice. Trees of ebony or even obsidian carved to look like trees dotted around her with leaves of white and light blue ice. She moved slowly as she observed her surroundings, the softest snow she'd ever felt muffling her steps. She looked up to see little floating orbs of blue fire carried by the breeze and lighting the forest around her. She walked within this icy wonderland, idly noting some rose bushes with white and black flowers, or at one point a waterfall coming from seemingly nowhere and pouring into a frozen pond. For several minutes she walked, her wonder nearly making her forget why she was even here in the first place, until she arrived at a particularly large tree. A weeping willow if she recognized it correctly, but within the long falling vine-like leaves there were hundreds of little orbs. Upon closer inspection she noticed it had a shadowy, moving image of trees and a running deer. From the point of view, she guessed that it was seeing through the eyes of the chaser. "Like my viewing tree?" asked a voice right behind her. Persephone jumped with a squeak as she whirled around to see Percy standing there, arms crossed and smirking wolfishly at her with amusement in his flaming eyes. She huffed while fighting down her embarrassed blush before remembering her manners and giving a little curtsy. "Hey, none of that," Percy said with a wave as she straightened. "Come on, this isn't a council meeting. So, what can I help you with, Persephone?" he asked lightly. Persephone shied away from his gaze as her nerves stirred up again, wondering if somehow this would be all for nothing. "No, I need to try. I won't stand silent about this, she thought as she looked her king in the eyes. I have a request, my lord, she said, slipping back into formal form while Percy raised one eyebrow but made no motion to interrupt. After some thought over the last few days, She trailed off as her heart hammered away in her chest, her hands wringing the sides of her gown. Can you spare my mother? Percy Pav. Percy looked at Persephone in surprise, not having expected the goddess's request in the slightest. He watched her carefully, seeing the near-desperate glint in her eyes as she looked at him. Why? He asked after some time, even if he had a sneaking suspicion of why. Because, Persephone started as she glanced down for a moment before looking at him again. She's my mother, she said in a trembling voice. I know that at times she has been a petty goddess and caused such things as famine and strife, but was it honestly that bad? That bad? He echoed with a slightly colder voice, his eyes flashing icily. The random starvation of entire regions and the suffering, completely disregarding season and local conditions wasn't that bad. He asked sarcastically. Not like that. Persephone quickly backpedaled as she noted his tone. The loss of life was bad but, Persephone dropped to her knees as she looked at Percy pleadingly. Please, regardless of what she's done, she can't be deserving of what happened to Ares. He was a bastard, through and through. Senseless wars and everything held within it were his passion, so turning it all against him has merited, but my mother hasn't done anything deserving that. Percy sighed as he scratched his chin while looking down at Persephone. You realize it's more than that, right? There are several gods and goddess on this very mountain that were her friends, many of whom she stood aside as they were punished and abused by her siblings while she did nothing. But she can hardly be blamed for that. Persephone retorted. Even if she had tried to help, it would have merely meant that she would have suffered along with them. Father was never very forgiving, and in the ancient times he was even more arrogant and entitled than he is now. Hard to believe, he muttered as he looked in her eyes. It's true. She persisted, her fists clenching up. I know sometimes the silent bystander can be just as guilty as the criminal in question, but she simply didn't have a choice. There wasn't any higher authority to report to, no one to enact the punishment. At best, all she could do was try to support the victims after the fact. Makes me wonder what would have happened if I just stood by, he replied with clear distaste. Plenty of times where I was in over my head or it was someone else's problem and I still stepped in to help, and I was just a mortal facing monsters and gods. He paused before giving a frustrated sigh while rubbing his temple. But could he really even compare his circumstances to that of Demeter? It had been a different time, and even if a goddess, she had been a woman, not particularly dangerous or aggressive, surrounded by violence-prone idiots with the law in their favor. Sadly, it was a very watch your own back environment, and even Hestia only got spared having to give similar concessions due to having the favor of her two brothers and generally staying out of the way. He was pretty sure it was thanks to her power and pulling a fast one with her maiden oath that even kept her virtue safe, otherwise Zeus and several others would have made far more attempts than the one recorded in mythology. But Demeter had neither the power nor the closeness with her two other powerful siblings to keep her relatively safe. At the end of the day, she simply became a part of them rather than stay as the odd one out. Petty, temperamental, obsessive with her domain, and generally disinterested in the happenings of man, whether they suffered or succeeded. Please, Persephone begged as she looked up at him while breaking him out of his thoughts. If it helps, I'll take part of the punishment or offer my own services, just let her live. Anything? He asked with a raised eyebrow, making her gulp nervously. Then, with a trembling hand, she started to reach for one of the straps of her gown, her eyes starting to get misty while Percy's widened in alarm. Acting quickly, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist before she could remove the strap, stopping her as the duo locked eyes while he silently cursed his big mouth. I see how far you're willing to go with this, he said, his mouth feeling oddly dry. Maybe the council needs to have a discussion of the fate of some of the Olympians. Seeing Persephone's face brightening, he raised his free hand to stop her. Don't jump the gun here. I may be king, but I don't rule alone, and in the end the council must come to the decision together. Pray that Demeter hasn't personally pissed off any of the members, save trying to stuff Nico full of grains a few years back, he added as an afterthought. Thank you. Persephone cried as she suddenly lunged forward to hug his knees. D.A. Chapter 96. Betrayals and Pleas IV. Percy Pav. Don't jump the gun here. I may be king, but I don't rule alone, and in the end the council must come to the decision together. Pray that Demeter hasn't personally pissed off any of the members, save trying to stuff Nico full of grains a few years back, he added as an afterthought. Thank you. Persephone cried as she suddenly lunged forward to hug his knees. He gave a bit of a grunt as he patted her back awkwardly while the goddess continued to thank him for even giving her request any thought. He mentally called for his shadows as he pried her off his legs and helped her stand. Within moments 3 shadows materialized to form Lupa, Medusa, and Lamia, all 3 looking at Persephone questioningly. Medusa, please escort Persephone out, he instructed softly as he handed the goddess to one of his guardians. Medusa nodded while gingerly leading the softly crying goddess away while Lamia and Lupa stood to his sides. Once they were out of sight he sighed as he leaned back, a throne of black ice instantly formed as he sat down. He rubbed his temple, idly noting how both his remaining guardians got comfortable. Lupa sat at his feet before crossing her arms over his knees and resting her head on them while Lamia sat at the right armrest and leaned onto his shoulder. So, what was that about? Lupa asked as her silvery yellow eyes looked up at him. He gave a mirthless chuckle before filling them in on the quick exchange, their faces looking thoughtful once he finished. I could see the council sparing her and a few others, Lamia commented. But you wouldn't let them off scot-free, would you? No, he replied as one of his hands found Lupa's head and started to scratch behind her materialized wolf ears, getting a content sigh from her. But then again, the type of punishments would have to depend on the goddess' willingness to accept their fault and try to make something of it. So no killing them on the battlefields but capture and trials instead. Lupa asked. Save 3, Lamia added with a smirk to which Percy nodded. I wonder what the council will think on this. He mused as he thought about several gods and their actions during the last decades since his disappearance. Many of the Olympians had become rather distant and cold with their children, though the only gods that had relatively high interaction was Artemis with her hunt, Hermes on some deliveries, and Dionysus, but he was just a miserable bastard at one of the camps. But even if you want to spare some, that doesn't mean they all deserve a trial or anything of the sort, Lamia suddenly added in as she looked at Percy. This is a war and the goal is the removal of the Olympians and other ancient threats that used this chance to escape their punishments. People die in war just because of the side they picked, nothing more, and if you want, no one says you can't take out a personal vendetta during war either. You're just saying that because you want to rip Hera apart rather than let her have any chance of escaping you, Lupa retorted with a smirk. That bitch has more than just me to answer to, Lamia replied with a scowl. I don't care if seeing her perfect son have his brains blown out already punished her enough. She cursed me to eat my own children and keep doing it for millennia. I intend to make her suffer for every child she damned since my creation. Feeling Lamia's energy rising with her agitation just thinking about the goddess got Percy to act, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her closer before giving her a strong kiss. She squeaked in surprise but quickly returned it, her earlier anger and tension melting away as she relaxing in his embrace. After a few seconds he broke the kiss and looked at her silly smile before glancing to Lupa and seeing her pouting at him with her wolf ears lying flat on her head. Come here, he teased, to which she eagerly reacted, jumping up and sitting on his lap, straddling him as she kissed him while his free arm wrapped around her waist. The kiss was hungrier than the one he had with Lamia, but then again watching him give his affection to Lamia had probably worked Lupa up more. After a good minute he pulled back, but Lupa remained comfortably seated on him with Lamia to his side. Oh, I can't wait until you consummate with Andy and then we can have our turns, Lamia purred as she eyed him like a piece of meat. Don't forget about Rhea and Hestia, Lupa added excitedly. Yes, well, I'm still getting to that, and Andy hasn't fully gotten her punishment, so part of it is continued abstinence for her, he answered to them with amusement. But the war is our concern right now, so until then. Both his dark goddesses groaned at that while he shamelessly grinned. Still, his thoughts drifted back to Persephone and he couldn't help but wonder if there were others that felt like her. He understood that what happened to Ares was brutal, even if he had no prior knowledge of what exactly was going to happen to him, and he didn't really take any enjoyment out of it. The rush of battle. Sure, he could enjoy that and putting to test all he'd trained for. Beating down a pompous bastard and leaving them with broken bones, some taunts, and a crushed ego. He was your man. 'Cause suffering for the sake of suffering. Not really. Well, more like not usually, save for 2 special cases, but then again he knew his hatred of the moon goddess and the traitor he once called father was something of its own and independent of his feelings of the rest of the Olympians. Even Apollo's actions only merited a severe ass-kicking and possible castration, Then again there were others that wanted a nice piece of the sun deity, and even at the lightest punishment he severely doubted Jason would allow Apollo to keep his domains or immortality. Tomorrow's meeting is going to suck, he groaned while rubbing his temple. Don't forget about the discussion of new gods to ascend, a feminine voice said off to their side. All three turned their heads to see one Zoe Nightshade, dressed in her usual chiton but in black and hair loosely falling over her shoulders, a black tablet in her hands. Percy bit back another groan as he looked at his secretary, wondering if that near-sadistic smirk she briefly flashed had been his imagination. Having visited Talia's sky palace some time ago, he'd met up with the hero-turned-spirit, and somehow the conversation had turned into how each god was looking for someone or thing to monitor their offices in their place. Sure, he had Lupa, Lamia, and Medusa, but those three tended to be out in the field with him. Considering all his domains were in very little need of maintenance, he instead mostly oversaw domains having close relation to his or carefully watching the world through the eyes of his packs. After all, the night and darkness came long before sleep, dreams, and nightmares, meaning he could readily see into such things and affect them to a greater extent than most divine beings save Hypnos and Morpheus themselves. That plus his duties as king and the prayers he'd started to receive needed some attention. It honestly surprised him how many simple wishes of being safe and comfortable during the night, even said to other non-existent deities, still came to him. After all, a comforting presence to a child hoping the monster under their bed or in their closet didn't hurt them went a long way in helping them get over their fears. Still, with the war and his continued training, he sometime couldn't go through all the prayers and other responsibilities, so he hired Zoe. She loved it since being dead effectively left her with too much time and too little to do, not to mention it let her nag and yell at him about being a forgetful boy was right up there with her favorite pastimes. Breaking out of his thoughts, he looked at his longtime friend and chuckled as he stood down. Lupa got off his lap. Once standing, Zoe stepped closer and handed him the tablet to see a long list of small prayers and such given during the night, some of them marked as priority for consideration. Yeah, we are discussing god candidates as well, he murmured as he scrolled through the prayers, answering some and looking past others if he thought they were frivolous or unnecessary. There were some that were rather sickening, so he noted those prayers and who they came from. Tyche would enjoy screwing with those particular mortals, and if they still succeeded in their less than scrupulous intentions, Hades and Nico would get a hold of them soon enough. Can't the candidates be left for after the war though? Lupa asked as she glanced over Percy's shoulder to look at the listed prayers. Not with some domains like war, he replied without looking at her. Sure, even with the gods assigned to them, most domains continue to exist, but without a god the influence could run wild. Take war for example. Without a god to monitor that domain and who it affects, our war with the Olympians might manifest with the mortals at random between any countries that have even the slightest issues between them. A god of war can not only create war but also end them and isolate or spread them. Just look at the previous world wars to see what happens when a war god doesn't do their job or even helps increase war. Lupa and Lamia shivered at the thought, especially with how strong humanity's weapons were now. Last thing they wanted was to spend the next several centuries cleaning up a radioactive wasteland and basically restarting civilization. They stopped the Titans and then Gaia for a reason, so it would be pretty shitty for the humans to end up meeting that same end by their own devices instead. So, who are the candidates? Lamia asked after some silence, all three women watching him continue to sort through all the recent prayers. We have a few, but no names are being mentioned out of the closed session meetings for now, he replied in a slightly teasing tone, knowing that now at least Lamia would be literally itching with curiosity. It's Frank, isn't it? Lupa chirped up excitedly, like she'd just solved a big puzzle, but he shook his head, making her pout. Internally he smirked, loving how free and expressive Lupa had become since joining them, even if in the field she reverted to that stoic she-wolf he'd met so long ago. No. He's one of the most favored, but we know he wants peace more than anything, Percy said with a small sigh. He may be able to handle the duties of such a domain, but it would give him full godhood, something several of us avoided for a reason. I know someday he and Hazel will want to move on, and taking away their partial immortality will be simple to fix. But if they become full immortals and then swear their immortality to the council, it could be removed just as easily and they could die peacefully then, Lamia reasoned. True, but once a being has obtained true immortality, their original soul changes into that of divine essence, and that change cannot be reverted. It will mean that their afterlife will belong to the realm of the fated under Lady Chaos, watch rather than the underworld. Considering that any children they have are legacies and therefore mortals, they could possibly pass after entire generations of their own descendants have moved on. Why become immortal and go to an afterlife with other divine beings, many of which we have probably never heard of, instead of going to the underworld and joining the family they created? Since when did you become so knowledgeable about gods and their afterlife? Zoe lightly teased as a different tablet appeared in her hands, but this one was connected to local and international news and such, since she also kept him up to date with the world abroad. Nyx was an excellent teacher, Percy answered before willing the tablet to disappear in a burst of shadow. He sighed as he rolled his shoulders while glancing up to the endless night and stars above him. It's late, so I guess I'm turning in. With that said, he gave a quick goodbye kiss to Lupa and Lamia before glancing at Zoe with a cheesy grin. I'm good, she said with a laugh while waving him off. He chuckled with a nod before disappearing in a burst of darkness, on his way to his comfy bed and waiting queens. D.A. Chapter 97, Angel's Warpath I. A week later. Percy Pav. Percy sighed as the council session ended, several of said members heading out to go about their own business or prepare for the Olympians. They'd tracked the movements, and so far those task forces, or specialized groups, had formed up rather quickly. However, it wasn't to the joy of their demigods. His words in Ares' execution had done much to cast doubt on the Olympians, added their constant losses and their own treatment of the demigods, and it was a recipe for disaster. Granted, a good chunk of the demigods were gunning for them for similar reasons, though it was their assumption that Hestia was dead too, but they could work that to their advantage soon enough. So far the discussion had been on the point Persephone had brought up to him before, though he omitted her name or the circumstances of how she told him just to respect her privacy on the matter. Of course there had been some immediate voicing against even the thought of sparing any of the Olympians. Talia in particular wanted them gone, considering she had next to no positive view of them and calling them negligent, abusive, opportunistic bastards willing to pop out demigods only to suit a purpose. He really couldn't blame her on that front, but he still thought to give some doubt. His motion to spare Demeter had passed, but she wasn't off scot-free by any sense of the word, and Rhea had been appointed to handle that particular case, though they decided any captured or willingly surrendered Olympians would face a trial before any sentencing. Apparently she intended to give the spanking that was millennia late to her wayward daughter, and Hestia had some choice words for the goddess she once called sister as well. Other gods were under a gray area, leaving their fate undecided for now, though the council had agreed to offer surrender any time said gods were encountered in combat, with willful surrenders gaining them far more leeway. Others were straight up getting the noose or sword the moment they were encountered, unless a specific primordial or chosen god was placed with the responsibility of the fate of the Olympian in question. That matter had actually gotten his attention, or more specifically, Andy's actions on taking responsibility for a particular goddess. His fiancée was in fact still sitting on her throne and intently reading one of her monitoring tablets. The golden edges and heart let him know that the tablet was set for a god. Getting up from his throne, he walked towards her until only just a step or so away before clearing his throat to get her attention. Oh, hey, she said after a small start while setting down her tablet. Can I help you with something? He looked at her silently for a few moments, before simply asking, why? It wasn't hard to get what he was talking about as she got more comfortable in her throne and hummed in thought before answering, it's complicated. I've got time, he continued, standing comfortably. So you do, she murmured before sighing and then looking at him in the eyes. I think she could change. Millennia-old goddess with one of the biggest egos of the Olympians. And one of the most adaptive that actually pays attention to the mortal world without screwing it up by sleeping with half the population or murdering the other half just for shits and giggles. Yes, she's got a lot of injustices and abuses to answer for, but I really think she can if given the chance. And how exactly do you plan to do that? He asked somewhat skeptically. Really, of all the gods on the council to redeem or reform, Andy had to pick one of the toughest cookies. At least she wasn't trying to pull Artemis' ass out of the fire. Now that was one goddess Percy was killing regardless of what anyone else said about reform and mercy. Was it for personal revenge? Absolutely. Did he give a damn? No sir. I'm keeping my plan a secret for now, but first I have to get a hold of her, Andy answered as she made the tablet disappear and stood up. Though, if things go well, part of her punishment could be used to help you deliver one of the final blows to Artemis. You devious little minx, he commented with a fanged grin. I know, I'm spending too much time with you, she retorted before closing the distance and giving him a quick peck. Now get going, I believe that Rhea wanted to show you something and even Raven tagged along with her. Wouldn't want both of them upset with you for taking your sweet time, would you? Percy felt a shiver of fear run down his spine at the thought. Between Ray's steely glare and Raven's kicked puppy face, he was a goner. Right, he said before all but dashing off to the sound of Andy's laughter. I'll get her later, he swore as he moved out of the throne room, shrinking all the while, and raced towards the hall with the doors leading to the offices. He jumped over some got in his way and ducked under another carrying a log before passed into the hallway and skid to a stop right at Ray's office. The thick oak door opened without him even having to knock, letting him know he'd been a tad too slow and now Rhea was antsy. At least with Raven he knew he could fix it with a trip to a recently opened ice cream parlor in the residential district. Sighing in resignation to his fate he walked in but was surprised to see what was usually a dense forest thick with all manner of trees was covered in a light coating of snow. Normally Ray's office looked a forest straight out of one of those dinosaur documentaries covering a large mountain with a large, two-floor cabin somewhere in the center. The forest itself she used as a testing ground for new plants and animals she was creating, or she could will a portion of her forest to mirror somewhere in the world and let her get a direct view of the natural conditions. However, he didn't think that would need her to cover the whole mountain and forest in snow. Well, at least it gave him an idea of what she was working on, and it had to do with cold weather. Knowing that he was already on a tight schedule, he seamlessly shifted into his wolf form, keeping his size to that of a rhino, and dashed across the terrain. His footfalls were almost silent as darkness and cold mist wafted off his pitch-black fur, his movement little more than a blur to the observing eye as the shadows cast by the trees almost merged with him as he passed. It took him little more than 10 or so minutes to ascend the mountain in the direction of Ray's cabin at his pace. He could see it closing in, the single chimney billowing smoke, no doubt with a kept of some hot soup cooking inside. He slowed to a trot of sorts as he neared, pausing when he caught the sound of flapping. Knowing what was coming, he glanced up in time to see a bright and cheery face and icy blue eyes of his daughter. "Papa," she eagerly chirped as she tackle-hugged his head, wrapping her wings around his snout and looking at him without a care in the world. "Hello," he returned, his voice carrying the underlying growl as she scrambled over his head and quickly moved to sitting on his shoulders, making him sigh. "Reduced to a pony of all things," he muttered with a low chuckle. "Auntie Rhea is in the back with the surprise," she instructed, nearly vibrating with excitement about whatever it was. "So giddy up." He gave an indignant snort but moved regardless, purposely bumping his shoulders up to bug her, because why not? A father should strive to annoy and embarrass his daughter on principle, regardless of suffering feminine retribution later on. In another minute or so he got around Ray's cabin to spot said goddess standing to a massive, light blue crystal measuring nearly 3 stories in height and wide enough to fit a decent-sized house. Within the massive structure was an equally large animal as far as he could tell, though he couldn't get a definitive shape. He walked up to Ray's side as Raven slipped off and then shifted back to his regular form, all the while keeping his eyes on the crystal. He then looked to Rhea with a questioning gaze as she finally looked at him too. "You're late." Her tone alone rang danger bells in his head. "Had to talk with Andy for a moment about the session," he explained quickly. She gave him a stern look, probably taking joy in watching him sweat it out, before nodding. He wasn't sure whether to sigh in relief or not. Regardless, they both turned their attention to the crystal again before he asked, "So, what am I looking at?" D.A. Chapter 98, Angel's Warpath 2. Had to talk with Andy for a moment about the session, he explained quickly. She gave him a stern look, probably taking joy in watching him sweat it out, before nodding. He wasn't sure whether to sigh in relief or not. Regardless, they both turned their attention to the crystal again before he asked, "So, what am I looking at?" Rhea started as he glanced at her. "You know how you've been having trouble coming up with a creature to safeguard the North and South Pole?" "Yes. Well, since wolves weren't working out, I thought about a different creature that could survive in the regions and maintain the climate while also being strong enough to ward off potential human hunters, and I came up with this," she said, gesturing to the crystal. At the wave of her hand, the crystal started to crack and shudder, the figure inside starting to shudder slightly. Raven, who had been studying the crystal from barely a foot away, squeaked as a piece nearly hit her, making her dash around and hide behind him while peeking over his shoulder. He watched curiously as dust and mist started to billow up, obscuring the sight. It took a few seconds for it to clear, and all the while Percy could hear the massive figure moving slightly, the ground shaking slightly with the careful steps taken. Once the dust settled, Percy couldn't help but whistle while Raven gasped and Rhea smirked. Before them was what Percy could only call a woolly mammoth on steroids. Standing a good 7 meters at the shoulders, thick legs with densely coiled muscle that was barely hidden the thick, dusted gray coat. Long, barely curved tusk that looked sharp enough to punch through a foot of steel and tipped with a familiar, light blue crust and similar icy blue eyes to his wolves. The creature literally radiated cold as the temperature slowly dropped around it, though none of the three were bothered by it. You so went to the underworld and talked with my mother before this, didn't you? He asked as he walked forward, meeting the gaze of the newly awakened prehistoric creature, or did being newly created make it postmodern? Yep, how else was I supposed to know mammoths were one of your favorites? She retorted, the amusement ringing clear in her voice as Raven approached as well, looking at the woolly beast in awe. He's strong, Percy murmured as he rested a hand against the foreleg, still meeting his gaze, noticing the gleam of intelligence in his eyes one would expect from the likes of a chimp or dolphin, possibly smarter. Raven walked up to the head, the mammoth looking away from Percy to Raven and eyeing the small woman curiously. Tentatively it used its trunk to poke Raven experimentally, his daughter giggling all the while before she hugged his trunk. And he's fluffy, she said with glee before the mammoth raised his trunk and her along with it, much to her delight. Percy smiled before he bent down and picked up a crystal fragment, recognizing the signature of his own ice within it. So this is why you asked me for all those chunks of ice, he said as he looked at her. Yeah, I have a decent grasp of your cold domain, being married and all, but sometimes it's better to work from the source, she said as she walked up to Percy's side and watched as Raven and the mammoth continued to study each other, much to their amusement. It took a few tries, but I finally got it right, and this bull is the first to fully grow. I'll make him a few cows to start up a herd soon enough. But what about food? Percy asked. I can't imagine that being this big comes with a little appetite. They'll have the same problem I had with creating wolves to guard the Arctic regions. Follow me and see, she replied as she walked off to a small garden a slight distance away. He followed, hearing the heavy steps behind him as the mammoth, and Raven riding atop, followed him. They walked for only a few minutes, approaching a large garden Rhea had formed. Within were an expanse of small shrubs and even small trees with odd, round white fruits hanging from the branches. Haven't really gotten around to naming them, but after 8 tries I finally figured out how to form these Arctic plants, Rhea explained as she picked one of the orange-sized fruits and tossed it to Percy. He found it surprisingly cool to the touch and smelled somewhat like grapefruit. They'll grow best in nearly freezing weather and can absorb minerals from even the deep, frozen bedrocks of the Arctic and Antarctic. If planted on an ice sheets, the roots will grow until it reaches the actual sea underneath, which is also nutrient-rich. Percy gave his wife an impressed look as he took a tentative bite of the fruit, a nearly clear, bluish juice spilling out. Orange-sized, smelling similar to grapefruit, but its taste was closer to that of melon, and biting it felt similar. He enjoyed it, but it wasn't really his take, so he offered it to the mammoth, who took it with his trunk and after eyeing it curiously, tossed it into his massive mouth. Apparently the taste was just right to him, as not a moment later he started to pick the fruits himself, even going as far as passing one to Raven before returning to his treats. Scientists are going to go bonkers when they find these, Percy commented, getting an agreeing nod from Rhea as the pair continued to move while Raven stayed with the mammoth. Once a slight distance away, Percy glanced at the mammoth again before asking, what about population control? Your wolves will do nicely from time to time just to keep the future herds in check, Rhea replied as they both watched the kids, from their view, continue to eat and play, making Percy frown slightly as he watched his daughter smile. Rhea glanced at him before asking in a near whisper. Percy, how are you and Andromeda feeling about Raven? He sighed as his shoulders slumped while looking at his wife. Honestly, neither of us want her to start her duties as Andy's guardian. Even if she's more or less come into an adult mentality, though she sure doesn't act like it when alone with us. The domains are a mess, aren't they? Rhea asked with her own frown. Aphrodite's relationship with Ares did so much more than she realized. Her confusion between love and lust for a violent and abusive disgrace of a man has left deep marks in human society. Sure, it's not like she is the reason certain tendencies in regards to sex and love exist because of her, but she did unknowingly, or possibly knowingly, spread and ingrain them. Hell, even the regions that haven't had contact with Greek culture and religion can show traces of that influence. And now Raven is meant to be Andy's direct hand in the affairs of mortals, which entitles being a killer, even if those cases are little more than rabid dogs, Rhea said as she absent-mindedly looked up at the mountain overhead. Percy gave a mirthless chuckle as he followed her gaze. You know, I used to wonder where gods got off in the way they judged for mortals. Even if most and not all have abused that authority for petty reasons at times, but now I find it hard to criticize them. Here we are, demigods turned gods, and we're already casting judgment on the mortals, deciding who dies and how they should progress. He then looked at his own trembling hands. I'm a hypocrite too. I want to make Artemis and Poseidon suffer just as much as I did. I want to rip apart everything they have and only end them when they have nothing left to live for. I even started a fucking war for it and now hundreds of lives will be dragged into it. He then looked at his wife, searching within her eyes for the answers to his troubled thoughts ever since his encounter with Persephone. Who's to say down the line in a decade, a century, maybe even millennia away that we won't become worse than the Olympians and the Titans ever were? Who will? Percy, Rhea interrupted in a stern voice as she cupped his cheek. Calm down and listen to me carefully. She waited for him to nod slowly, her free hand moving up to rest against his chest, right over his heart. You are a primordial god, the highest tier of power possible and only answerable to Lady Chaos herself, but you are not infallible, you are not omnipotent, you are not perfect. None of us are, so you are bound to make mistakes, but you know what makes you so different from the previous ruling councils. That you question yourself, that you doubt, that you remember where you came from and how you started out. She glanced down softly at her hand still resting over his chest before looking at him with a fire in her eyes. So what if the start of all this was for revenge after the murder of your parents? I don't think anyone could judge you for it, and regardless, if not you, then who? You have lived it, you know how demigods and many a monster alike were created and later made to suffer from the injustice of the Olympians, just like the Titans were betrayed by many who sided with the 6 Olympians during the First War. Again the oppressed rise against the tyrants as history knows it, you were simply the first to take a stand and Nyx offered you the chance. And yet you're still trying to be the hero and save as many as possible. You've gone and done the illogical thing, and instead of forming an army or using your power to crush everything representing the Olympians, you're trying to spare those who follow and support them because it is the only thing they know. Rhea paused to take a breath, glancing over her shoulder to check and make sure Raven was still thoroughly entertained before returning her attention to Percy. You could have covered the world in pitch darkness and frozen everything until it is a wasteland. The last dregs of the labyrinth and the impressive cavern base of the Amazons. Gone, crushed and entombed with a wave of my hand. Mount Olympus and the camps. Jason and Talia could blow it all to bits within hours from our house above the planet. Nico and Styx could unleash literal hell on the mortal world, Hestia could cause eruptions and infernos to scorch the land while stripping humanity of hope itself. Just one of us assuming our divine forms in the mortal plane would cause as much devastation, not to mention radiation, as the entire US's stockpile of nuclear weapons set off at once. We could have won already, but instead of taking it easy, we're trying to spare the world for the crimes of the few. D.A. Chapter 99, Angels Warpath 3. Mount Olympus and the camps. Jason and Talia could blow it all to bits within hours from our house above the planet. Nico and Styx could unleash literal hell on the mortal world, Hestia could cause eruptions and infernos to scorch the land while stripping humanity of hope itself. Just one of us assuming our divine forms in the mortal plane would cause as much devastation, not to mention radiation, as the entire US's stockpile of nuclear weapons set off at once. We could have won already, but instead of taking it easy, we're trying to spare the world for the crimes of the few. She then paused as she moved her hand from his cheek and chest to cup his hands together. And, even if it sounds arrogant and entitled, being gods we stand above man. It is our right to control and protect our domains even if by those decrees some humans will always hate us. I want to protect the earth and nature, which means regardless of what corporation or government starts to complain when we're revealed will have to suck it up if they don't like it. I will protect my domains just like you protect your wolves or the innocent in the night, and Andromeda has the right to do so as well, even if it means Raven can't be your innocent little princess like you want. Percy dipped his head as she said that, barely managing from muttering that it wasn't fair. Of course it wasn't, but then again life simply wasn't. Every demigod's life was a testament to that, and sadly that included his daughter regardless of how much he wished against it. Even his future children would have to see the ugly side of life and humanity, because even without war horrible things existed and he couldn't hide them away from everything. After stewing for a few minutes, digesting Ray's words, he slowly nodded, understanding that she had a point and denying it would be useless. He started a war and now he had to finish it, accepting the consequences and lives that may be lost because of it, but he couldn't hesitate now. He was king, a leader, and his conviction to carry through with his decisions needed to be resolute. However, at times doubting himself and analyzing his own thoughts had merit as well, to keep him grounded and balanced. His inner turmoil slowly started to clear as Ray's words and their meaning truly registered in a faint smile as he looked at his wife. You really are too good for me. I really don't know what I would do without you and Hestia, he said as he gently wrapped his arms around her waist to pull her closer until their foreheads touched. She smiled softly before giving him a tender kiss and then pulling back. And we'll always be there to keep your head on straight and eyes forward. You're not only my king but my husband, and I won't stand for anything but the best from you, so chin up, mister. Yes, ma'am, he replied with a wolfish grin before the pair turned their gazes to see Raven approaching, covered in snow from the heap that the mammoth tossed on her. She smiled at them as she got close and was about to say something, but before she could, Percy pulled her in between himself and Rhea to hug her close, Rhea quickly joining in to smother Raven in affection. Papa? She asked as she wiggled enough to move her hands from her sides to his chest while looking at him curiously. Oh, I just felt like hugging you, he said innocently, simply enjoying the moment and knowing they would become rare in the near future as the war picked up. Raven didn't offer any protest in the slightest, giving him a big smile before she snuggled closer, sighing contentedly within their arms as Rhea smiled down at her near-stepdaughter. He smiled as well, the war in Olympian slipping to the back of his mind for now. Next morning. Amphitrite panted as she tried to recover her breath, her throat sore and pain continuously feeding back through her body. Her arms were shackled to the stone ceiling above, biting into her skin as ichor slowly oozed from the broken skin. Her skin felt dry, her sweat having all evaporated some time ago. Her knees shook with the weakness of lacking energy and dehydration. Her body was bare and exposed, much to her indignation and humiliation, the mocking laughter echoing in her head after days of the repeated performances. She flinched as the first rays of the morning sunlight passed through the celestial barred windows of her prison. She looked through those same windows, the sea beyond taunting her like her tormentors. Like the one currently sitting across the small cell from her, lounging back in his seat with a glass of wine in his hand and dirty rag resting on a small table beside him. He was tall for mortal standards, reaching over 8 foot with a muscular body. His attire was an odd mix of the new and old. Jeans stretched to their limits with celestial bronze-tipped boots, a glowing celestial bronze breastplate with a black leather jacket over it to cover his arms. She could see the edges of his bracers just past the cuff of the sleeves. His helmet was off to reveal his dirty blonde hair and glowing gold eyes. Not wanting to see his smug face, she glanced again at the rag. That rag, soaked in her ichor after he used it to clean his hands. She would have growled and cursed him if she had the energy, but sadly she didn't. She looked down to see a massive handprint seared into her side just below her right breast, the skin cracking with small trails of ichor. Hyperion, you bastard, she thought as she looked at her uncle again. Her chief guard and tormentor, the Titan of Light, had been more than adept at making her stay far from enjoyable. She could only count her lucky stars that her mother's intervention had kept her from being used as entertainment, for now. Who's to say Poseidon wouldn't keep her as a broken trophy later on just to spite her? Granted, that's been her existence for the last couple thousand years anyways. Still, thoughts of the future would do little for her considering her circumstances. Over a week, locked up on some tropical island under a barrier erected by Pontus. It was the perfect location for a small operations base in her torture. Being a god, she couldn't starve, beatings and rape was too simple apparently, and they didn't want her anywhere she could get help. So here she was, slowly being dried into a husk, cruelly close to the waters that could restore her but also impossibly far, with her uncle practicing how to brand on her. Getting quiet, or we. She heard her uncle chuckle in amusement, but she kept her head down. Too tired to scream. His chuckles didn't last as his taunts carried no effect, but she heard him set his glass down and stand up, his steps getting closer before she felt him grab her head to force her head up. She saw his smirking face, but it disappeared when she spit a glob of ichor in his face. No sooner than a second passed before he backhanded her, knocking at least 2 teeth out and probably fracturing her jaw, but she still didn't scream. It hurt, but it didn't compare to being branded alive. Luckily he couldn't for now. No, the possibility of killing her stayed his hand. He practiced his skills at night after giving her some water. Just enough to keep her stable enough and then make her nights miserable. The day she was merely taunted, put on display so that the human mercenaries and monster forces could leer at her. Filth. If she could slaughter each and every soul on this damn island with a rusty knife, she would lose no sleep over it. So, even through the pain, she glared back at him defiantly as he wiped the divine blood of his face before scowling down at her. He responded by grabbing her still injured shoulder, the puncture wounds from Poseidon's trident getting a sickly copper tone, and squeezed. She bit down on her own lips to stop from screaming even as tears trailed down her eyes. Ho! Still being tough, are you? No matter, they all break eventually and then you'll practically beg me for mercy. At any price, Hyperion commented as he finally let go and strolled back to his seat. Makes me wonder why you still try that act. Your mother's last kindness aside, no kingdom, husband, or allies to come for you, and a bleak future. I've seen many men break down at such odds and prospects. Maybe because I know you'll get what's coming to you, she finally answered as she glowered at him with contempt. Big bad Hyperion, bested by a demigod and satyrs in the last war, and now that same demigod and others have grown too strong for you, she said, ignoring his near snarl as he stood up and continued regardless. War has already been declared, several gods dead, Mia and the remaining titans like you ran under the skirt of Pontus like the cowards you are. Mouthy little cunt, Hyperion snarled as her grabbed her jaw, his face only inches away. Jackson and his little merry band will fall. Powerful they may be, but at the same time they are weak. They think that 9 and only a handful of warriors is enough when our armies grow by the thousands, and even then we have our elite added with the blessings and training of Pontus himself. But not for you, since you aren't worth it, she ground out, enjoying holding his failings over him. She heard enough talk around along with a visit from her oh so dear husband. His presence along with Oceanus had changed, pulsing with new and unexplored power, but Hyperion wasn't like them. One of the eldest titans and powerful, but a warrior like Poseidon and Oceanus he was not. He also didn't have an affinity for the sea, so why give him power specific to it if he couldn't even use it properly? His face literally burned with rage as she slapped her again, making her head spin as she heard him muttering about how he'll teach her a lesson. She could see through the haze as he was unbuckling his pants, but also the door to her cell opening. Her head cleared slightly as she heard Hyperion cry out in a mix of surprise and pain, her face breaking into a smile at the sight. It was Triton, dressed in standard Atlantean armor of forged silver with a crystal sword. A similar dagger jabbed into Hyperion's lower back as the elder Titan reached for it to pull it out. She was about to say something, but her son shouted, "No time!" as he swung his sword, shattering the chains holding her up. She fell almost limp into his arms before her grabbed onto her waist and half-dragged carried her out of the cell, but not before delivering a wild slash to the still recovering Hyperion, forcing the Titan to backpedal as he was unarmed. Triton ran with her through a network of tunnels as a siren suddenly went off, and Amphitrite could feel the temperature beginning to rise as the light around the island intensified. "I'm so sorry it took me this long," he said to her as they ducked down one passage and away from thundering footsteps. "It's okay, you came," she replied as her feet weakly trudged along the dirty stone floor, a few weak lamps being their only source of light as they moved deep through whatever fortress they were in. "No," he replied with a shake of his head as he tossed her over his shoulder before turning into a set of stone steps to the side, jumping 2 or 3 steps at a time. "I shouldn't have stood there like a fool while you were attacked. I shouldn't have even let them take you away." D.A. Chapter 100. Angel's Warpath IV. "It's okay, you came," she replied as her feet weakly trudged along the dirty stone floor, a few weak lamps being their only source of light as they moved deep through whatever fortress they were in. "No," he replied with a shake of his head as he tossed her over his shoulder before turning into a set of stone steps to the side, jumping 2 or 3 steps at a time. "I shouldn't have stood there like a fool while you were attacked. I shouldn't have even let them take you away." Amphitrite smiled at his words, but just barely as she fought down grimaces from the pain. Riding over her son's shoulder with several open and still bleeding burns along her body was not a pleasant experience. He kept moving, passing several floors. "Damn dungeons," Triton muttered before he finally stopped at one floor and exited into far more spacey halls. However, with the space there were already some mercenaries mixed with monsters, primarily Telchines. Triton didn't stop though, charging forward and covering the distance before any of the men could properly aim. With a roar, Triton swung his sword, cutting down up to 3 men at a time while knocking over others. He ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the lance of a Telchine before it could impale him in the side. He would have turned on the attacker, but the sound of more steps approaching clued him into the fact that they were running low on time. With a snarl he turned and ran, still carrying her over his shoulder even as mortal bullets pelted them uselessly. She thanked the heavens above that celestial bronze bullets were in very short supply, and regular lead bullets of lower calibers usually weren't enough to even pierce a god's skin. Still, she raged within her mind with her inability to help her son and instead weigh him down. If only she could get to a larger source of water, but then again, that could prove disastrous if Pontus is already aware of their attempt of escape. She highly doubted it was beyond the great primordial's ability to drown even them if he wished. She was broken out of her thoughts though as Triton exited the hall over the shouting of human forces and into the morning light of a large, stone courtyard. She flinched at the light as she adjusted, a cool sea breeze washing over her to soothe some of the ache of her burns. Triton then stopped as looked around before spotting a large gate and broke into a sprint towards it. Almost there, she heard him ground out as more mercenaries appeared from bastions along the roof of the fortress around them and fired another salvo onto them. She winced at the sting of the bullets and looked back to see another group of Telchines, this time joined by some Cyclops, charging after them with celestial bronze-tipped spears and steel clubs. She couldn't make much other observations though because Triton suddenly cried out after a rather large bang as he staggered. She almost fell of his shoulders but he held tight and she looked down to see that a slowly closing bullet hole meaning there had to be a human or two with higher grade guns. At least mortal weapons couldn't make lasting damage but it was enough to slow them down. Then Triton stopped, panting lightly with a thin film of sweat coating him, just a few more meters from the gates and the expanse of land leading to the sea beyond. Another group of Cyclops, these outfitted with large, celestial bronze clubs and axes, stood before them, 5 strong along with the ones catching up behind them. Triton gently set her down as he positioned himself protectively in front of her with his sword at his side. The two sides remained at a standstill as the pair was surrounded in all sides, modern and ancient weapons pointed at them from all sides. Damn it, Triton muttered under his breath as his free hand pulled out a small dagger into a reverse grip. Mother, listen, do you think you could sprint the last bit on your own? He asked while scanning around them. What? She asked him in return, hoping that he wasn't about to suggest what she thought he would. If I make an opening, could you make it to the sea and then hopefully flash away, he continued. The barrier stops just at the shore and from what I gather, Pontus, Oceanus, and Father are all busy at the moment. No. I'm not leaving you. She protested at once, just barely forcing herself to a knee and looking at Triton with pleading eyes. We don't have a choice. He snapped back, finally taking his eyes off their enemies. I don't care. She retorted as she looked at him. Then you escape. I'm probably too weak to flash anyways and I don't have my pearl. Suddenly Triton's eyes widened as he dropped the knife and fished into the pocket of battle skirt and brought out a familiar white pearl with a broken chain. She gasped at the sight of it, her hopes looking up before she heard and felt the approach of Hyperion, the ambient temperature seeming to rise as the morning light grew in intensity. She glanced back to see Hyperion now armed with a massive, claymore-like sword glowing gold in his hands. His confident grin only made her grow agitated so without a second to spare she turned to her son and grabbed his hand with the pearl inside it. Crush it, she ordered and he complied, turning the pearl to a fine white dust in a moment before the dust seemed to envelop them. She could feel the energy stored starting to coat them as she heard Hyperion shout an order but she didn't care for it, just knowing that they would escape even the barrier around them prevented flashing but hopefully other means of teleportation. However, just as she felt the beginnings of transport she heard another loud bang followed by an excruciating pain making her scream. Through tears she looked down to see a celestial bronze harpoon lodged through part of her lower gut, the barbs digging and tearing into her skin. She couldn't do anything before it was violently pulled back in her along with it, separating her from her son as he cried out for her, but it was too late. In a white flash he was gone as she fell back, bleeding out with the sound of Hyperion's laugh in the background. She couldn't stop the new tears, her last hope slipping away as she realized her hell was about to get worse. Jason paused same time. At least once a week they would all gather for a shared meal. Usually dinner but this time around it had been breakfast in the courtyard behind their temple in a picnic style. Jason had just been debating with Hercules about his new dream and obsession to spread the wonders of CrossFit across the world while some of their friends snickered in the background. He'd been arguing against the need for such extreme measures of fitness for those of a more civil lifestyle but the newly named god of strength and fitness of all things was adamant on converting the masses. Off to the side they would also occasionally glance at their king as Percy was metaphorically and literally pulled from all sides. Medusa had taken to teasing her king for his attention much to the chagrin of Raven, being daddy's little princess and also both were vying for his attention. Medusa wanted him to feed her, Raven pouting all the while and offering to feed him while Lamia pressed up against his back and generally throwing more fuel into the flame and Lupa sat back about while shaking her head at them. Lastly were the queens and Andy sitting just a little further, all three looking on in amusement and pretending they didn't notice the pleading looks Percy sent their way. Styx sat with Nico and Will, still hounding both of them but if rumor was to be believed, slowly warming them to the idea through teasing and suggestive ideas. Lastly was Talia sitting with Phoebe and some other goddesses, namely Hecate, Thea, and Eos, and discussing some of the businesses the goddesses were starting up or expanding through their growing influence with the Canadian government. Sadly, the joy of the morning couldn't last as Jason's head snapped up from his meal as he felt the pearl he'd given to Amphitrite break, his action being noticed by the rest of the council and guests. The light atmosphere evaporate as he shot to his feet as he felt the light condense in front of him, the other gods shooting up too with some willing their weapons to them. However, they all stopped in surprise as the light flashed out to drop a tired and slightly injured dude that vaguely resembled Percy in front of him. The man, with oddly blue-toned skin, looked around wildly with his sword in hand before his eyes landed on Percy. "Jackson!" he shouted in surprise as he took a step back, forgetting that Jason was behind him and bumping into him. "Wow there!" Jason said as Triton wheeled around with sword raised. He was about to ask who he was and where was Amphitrite, but Percy beat him to it. "Triton," he said as he approached quickly. "What's going on?" Jason could tell that he was on guard, and now all others who weren't before were, knowing that they were in the presence of the lieutenant of Poseidon. "No time, my mother needs me." Triton shouted as he gave the warning signs of beginning to flash but was stopped when Jason clapped a firm hand on his shoulder, effectively grounding him to the spot. "What happened to Amphitrite?" he asked in a deadly serious voice as Triton glared at him. "What happened? What happened is that Oceanus and Pontus came and revealed that she was consorting with you, and for the last week she's been held on an island and being tortured." He nearly roared as he tried to shake Jason's grip, but he wasn't letting go. "What island?" he asked as the pressure of his divine aura started to manifest in a white glow, making it harder to breathe for most of the present gods save the council members. "A remote 150 miles north of Funchal near the Canary Islands," he replied, his agitation being cowed but the power rolling off Jason. He focused his sight through his domain near the Canary Islands, searching for Amphitrite but instead found a blank spot roughly the distance north that Triton said. He clicked his teeth, knowing that it would take even them a few minutes to break a barrier that had been held up for a week or longer by Pontus, and he wasn't sure if that barrier prevented his own forces from flashing in or out. Last thing he needed was to tip off whoever was holding Amphitrite. "Is the barrier physical?" Jason asked quickly. "No, they have mortals that need to come and go. You just can't flash there without the express permission of Pontus," he answered as he started to fidget. "Now let me go. She was left weak and injured with Hyperion, and who knows what they'll do to her now." Jason did let go of Triton, but the sea god didn't get a chance to do much more before he was knocked on his ass as Jason flared his power, his wings springing out of his back as his coat of light materialized and his sword appeared in its sheath at his hip. He then noticed Percy and Nico nearing him quickly, but before they could stop him he shouted, "Don't try it. She's there because of me and I'm not leaving her. Who said we are stopping you?" Percy shot back as he gave off a far more controlled release, his wings, coat, and swords appearing in a moment with Nico doing the same. "We're going with you," Percy added within a clipped tone. Jason nodded back as the three looked to the others, giving a quick wave and in Percy's case receiving an hug and to be careful from Raven. Without another second's hesitation the three primordials kicked off the ground and soared into the skies above, clearing the morning clouds in their wake before Percy and Nico each grabbed one of his arms. "Flash us there," Percy ordered, to which Jason nodded, the familiar silvery glow encompassing them before they were gone in an instant only to reappear above the Atlantic, just over 1,000 feet above the island Triton specified. "Leave Hyperion to me," Jason all but growled as the rage literally made him steam. "I'll get Amphitrite out of there and we'll," Nico said as all three drew their weapons. "And I'll cut down the rest," Percy finished while nodding to the specks of boats, all coated black and without markers, headed for the island. Without another word all three closed up their wings, plummeting to the earth below. The wind roared in their ears and assaulted their eyes, but they didn't so much as register it as the island drew closer and more of the forces became visible. Human mercenaries, Telchines, Cyclops, and two distinct figures in the center of a ring of them. They weren't aware of their approach, but their ignorance wouldn't last. They hit terminal velocity soon enough, and by now were getting close enough to see faces turned up from the monsters that felt them approaching. Jason spun around to have his feet facing the ground and sword drawn to his side before he braced himself. Boom! Their arrival was loud and rough, shaking the very island as the ground crater underneath each of them, but Jason shook off the tension in his legs as the dust settled, idly noting that he'd crushed a gate and some humans on impact, but they weren't his concern. His eyes instead fell on Hyperion, or more importantly, what was in his hands. Held by her hair was Amphitrite's bloody face with a clearly broken jaw and body hanging limply as Hyperion held her up. The sight only enraged him more, making him vow to pay Hyperion back for every ounce of pain he put Amphitrite through. Hyperion! He roared as the island and sea around them shook beneath his wrath, his body launching forward like a cannonball and his blade already poised to cut him to pieces. If you want to support me or just to read ahead of the public release, you can join my Patreon. Patreon Moonhorse.